Blog Talk Radio.
I saw a cloud today. I watched it change and shape. Into a dinosaur, a whale, a mermaid, and a plane. The mermaid was pregnant, and then it turned into a Doberman. And the Doberman just turned back into the sky. Then I saw a real plane flying awfully low, man, dropping toxic chemicals all over my town. They're to help us, but they're trying to hold us down and try and take away our clouds and replace them with their own. Crop dust downtown, they stain the ozone, but they don't care about your home. They're just trying out new ways of population control. We're young and we're bold. We can throw away their laws and replace them with our own. And the story will be told how the roots of young adults move over the roof of grown, shone a light on just how bright this world can surely shine. So if you're working sexually, but even in reality, over the road to stay, you've got to be in the right state of mind. I saw a bird today, I watched it fly away, and in my heart I knew I had to do the same. Town really got to me, the streets felt rotten to me, and I still can't stand those goddamn fucking planes. But they're only flying now, someday they'll be bombing town. They already started their secret chemical war. They've taken all we have and still want more. The sky is saturated with rain. I swear I'm not insane. It's going for more. It's going for more. Don't you use no phone, because the government can bug anybody's home. But don't walk the streets alone. They might steal you in the night without your family being told. But we're young and we're bold. We can throw away their laws and replace them with our own. And the story will be told about the roots of young adults going over the roof of grown, shone a light on just how bright this world can surely shine. So if you're working conceptually, but even in reality, to overload the state, you've got to be in the right state of mind. You've got to be in the right state of mind. There's no telling just how far we can fly. We're just in the right state of mind.
Isn't that right, everybody? Gotta be in the right state of mind to do this kind of work we're doing here at the Universal Truth Evolution, which is bringing all the information major media tends to shy away from. I'm your host, once again, Jerry Avalos, bringing you all this sweet goodness of awareness to everyone. Today we have an awesome guest, really. Andy Basiago, hope I'm saying his name right, and I believe he's online with us, and I'm just going to check that right now. Andy, is that you?
Hi, Jerry. Yeah, this is Andy Basiago. Yes, I'm on.
Great. It's an honor to have you here, and I wanted to bring you on as soon as possible because you have so much information to share that it's probably best to just jump right into it and move his head as much as possible here. So if you would, maybe just kind of give yourself an intro for the audience as well here and in the archives.
I'm a lawyer here in Washington State, and I've been practicing since 1996. For the last several years, I've been leading a public disclosure campaign to inform the people of the United States and indeed the people of the world that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the U.S. government secretly developed a time travel capability. I speak of it as a quantum access capability because it not only involved different devices that enable the U.S. government to physically relocate people in the time-space continuum, but another major emphasis of the program was the development of devices to technically remote view non-local locations in the quantum hologram. So we're really talking about sending people to the past and future and propagating holograms to either send them there on a physio-virtual basis if they were standing in the holograms, or simply to look into the holograms and gain a sort of a window to the past or the future on a technical basis without time traveling there physically. I was a child participant in the project. It was called Project Pegasus. It was under the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which was then called not DARPA, but ARPA, simply the Advanced Research Projects Agency. This is the U.S. government agency under the Department of Defense that brought us the Internet. But something that they secretly developed 40 years ago that they kept secret after weaponizing it was time travel. And so I'm speaking out because I believe, for example, well, let's talk about the positive capabilities of some of the devices. The Tesla teleportation device that Project Pegasus developed enabled the U.S. government to find a way, and they reduced it to practice by 1970, to open up a tunnel in the time-space continuum that somebody could physically pass through in seconds to a location thousands of miles away in the time-space continuum. And I believe that technology should now be declassified and deployed, with the United States leading the effort on a global basis to make that technology available so that it can be used to advantage humanity with a revolutionary new form of transportation in the 21st century. We're going to be needing that technology to sustain ourselves in civilization. Another major positive capability that Project Pegasus developed was in the area of the chronovisors, these electro-optical devices that created holograms, for example, of past events. I mean, imagine the revolution in education, for example, among school children. If when they went to a national or a state museum, instead of seeing paintings of George Washington at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, they could see something in the nature of a television screen or a holographic array on a platform of Washington and other luminaries as they appeared during historic moments. I mean, children who are so technically literate at this point and so absorbed in the digital age, they would become transfixed by the different historical and scientific important moments that could be shown. And I think that this would spark a revolution in education around the world. So I'm speaking out because we really did something brilliant as a civilization. Our uniquely American civilization achieved different forms of time travel and of technical remote viewing of past and future events 40 years ago when, middle-aged people like myself, I'm 49 now, we were children. We were 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and I was one of the 140 American school children selected for the program. I went really to the farthest reaches experientially in the program for a variety of reasons. And so now I'm speaking out to inform humanity of this fact so that we can declassify these technologies and do good things with them. Yeah.
And it's great that you're doing the work you are to disclose this technology. I mean, I'm not sure if you saw in the news recently about some study being done by some people saying the world will be unrecognizable by 2050, and they're citing all these reasons that we kind of see, like fossil fuels running out, food production, blah, blah, blah. But then you and I know that it's like, well, that's only happening because this technology and other stuff that could be derived from it isn't available. So, and it should be. So
that's a conventional analysis. I mean, that's extrapolating from what the public realm or even our public representatives, our governmental leaders, who are not permitted to access data that's held secretly by basically the office of the president, the intelligence community, and the military. We're really talking about, at this point, a multi-generational conspiracy under the last 6 or 7 presidents. And in the way that they interact with the intelligence community and the military in keeping these technologies secret, so that when something is analyzed, like the forecast is made of the sustainability of our resources, they're not factoring in the fact that we're already in possession of technologies that will cause a paradigm shift in terms of, for example, efficiency, energy efficiency, that will really have an order of magnitude effect.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, if you could travel, I mean, imagine a plane flight, how foolish and wearisome, how basically fuel intensive and human energy intensive a flight from London, England to Sydney, Australia is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're burning all that fuel to push people through in this metal cylinder with wings on it for 24 hours. And as a result of, for example, utilizing airplanes, commercial airplanes for long-distance transport, we've been putting billions of tons of pollutants and particulates into the global atmosphere since 1970, when, in fact, teleportation was available to the U.S. government. I mean, think of that. When Al Gore was sitting in political science classes taught by the great Dr. Roger Revelle at Harvard, who was one of the first scientists and public policy experts to focus on the threats to our civilization posed by potential climate change. Of course, in those years it was spoken of as the greenhouse effect, not global warming. When Al Gore was sitting, being inspired by Roger Revelle at Harvard, secretly, our U.S. Department of Defense had already developed a revolutionary form of transport that could largely obviate the effects on the atmosphere of most forms of conventional transport. And so we're really kind of playing a false game here where we're analyzing what we've been told we have, and we're not factoring in the paradigm shift from the hidden technologies that were weaponized because they gave the U.S. government such an advanced military advantage, and they've been held back from the general population. I think that's wrong. It's un-American. I think we're a better civilization than that. And I think instead of continually preparing for wars of foreign adventurism around the world, we should be taking our American ingenuity and revolutionizing the technical infrastructure of the world so there don't have to be resource wars and so on.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and that's an important thing to state, really, because I think that so many are going to see that, and it just plays into that whole fear and control paradigm that we're specifically talking against. And so I felt that was synchronistic that this happens with your show, and we can talk about the applications in a practical way, which I think needs to happen as often as possible too. Some of the questions, though,
right.
Hold on, sir. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that the eagle, the American eagle on the Great Seal, doesn't just hold arrows. She also holds olive branches, and so I think we should be preparing to wage peace in equal measure that we're preparing to wage war. At this point, we're becoming an international pariah state because of our willingness to use military force essentially at whim. Whenever we feel we have a foreign policy goal that needs to be quickly gained or reinforced with force of arms, we're doing so, and that's not in the interest of the American people. It would be better for us to be the heroes of the world by revolutionizing the technical infrastructure of the world so that we create a world that works for everyone. And that's why I'm speaking out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also fairly synchronistic that we have you here on our American holiday on President's Day. Considering one of your experiences, shall we say, it's not really a story, I'd say it's more of an experience, because you do have the corroboration concerning President Lincoln and having that experience. I was wondering if you can go into that a little bit here for our audience.
Well, I had the presidential dimension of my account essentially involves several sidebars that implicate the U.S. presidency. I don't know why I was fated to play that role in history, but it just evolved both from the time-space probes that we were doing utilizing, well, to the distant past, certainly we weren't using teleportation. We were using the chronovisors, which basically set up these holograms of past events. But there were several paradoxes to the holograms. One was that when you stood on the stage and this hologram was focused around you, it was basically a dense cube of light that was being emitted by a crystal array above the stage that was actually an octagonal, an eight-faceted array of bismuth crystals. And as my father, Raymond, who was one of the project principals, he was essentially the point man between the Ralph M. Parsons Company and the Central Intelligence Agency on the theory and practice of the Tesla teleportation generating these holograms of, for example, past events. And he said they're driving an electromagnetic signal through this 8-sided crystal array made up of bismuth crystals, and that was causing essentially the hologram to be focused on the stage. And then there were men operating these two devices that were emitting something across the hologram. I think it may have been positrons, but I didn't learn that when I was serving on the project as a child. But I was told that those two boom operators, as my dad described them, were fixing the time and the space coordinate of the hologram. So, for example, they could focus in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, September 17th, 1787 at 1 o'clock, and get the signers of the Constitution sitting in Constitution Hall there right after lunch. Okay. So utilizing that technology during one of the summers that I spent in New Mexico on a project basis, they kept on sending me back to the scene of the assassination of President Lincoln on April 14th of 1865 at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. So they would set me down via chronovisor because they could tune in precise locations and moments at that location. And I would always pop into view in the muddy street outside essentially the sidewalk landing of Ford's Theater. And it was my mission, as my father described it to me, to go to the front table. There was a table at the entryway to Ford's Theater that evening where individuals were taking people's tickets. But I didn't have a ticket, I presume, because maybe they couldn't locate a valid ticket from that night when President Lincoln was fated to be shot there by John Wilkes Booth. So I was dressed in the finery of a kind of a society child, like let's say the son of an ambassador or cabinet minister cabinet official would wear during that era. Pretty fancy. I was actually quite embarrassed in it. I preferred the Union Bugle form that I was later dressed in. But so they dressed me in kind of society, evening kind of fancy suit. And I was instructed to walk up to the table and explain that my parents had already provided their ticket to the ticket man there and had walked in and been seated. And each time I successfully talked my way past the table. But what I found is every time that I essentially walked into Ford's Theater in these chronovisor probes, small details would change a little bit. I mean, clearly Our American Cousin starring Laura Keene was being presented that night. It was Ford's Theater. It was April 14th of 1865, toward the end of the U.S. Civil War. President and Mrs. Lincoln were destined to appear there that night. In fact, one time when I walked across the lobby, I looked to my right and I saw the Lincolns walking in past me. And President Lincoln appeared very stoop-shouldered and very emaciated by 1865. He was almost skeletonous. We now think that he not only had Marfan syndrome, but perhaps even cancer, and that he would have died in a year or two had he not been shot there that night. And then I would walk across the lobby, and let's say on the first time they sent me there, a man was a dandy, some well-dressed gentleman was walking across the lobby talking to a beautiful damsel in her evening dress. Well, the second time they sent me, let's say he would still walk by, but either, let's say, by himself or talking to two ladies. So there were these small little changes. It was almost as if I was in the same fishbowl, but the fishes were swimming by in different directions. And as my father explained, it was my assignment to walk up the staircase and get behind the Lincoln's balcony seating and try to see who shot President Lincoln. And so they sent me there that summer, I would say maybe 7 or 8 times, and it was very bizarre. It was almost as if I was visiting the same dream all the time. And the small details would change, but I did at one point, one time, I think the first time when I went up, I was locked out. Another time I was chased away by a Union guard, presumably guarding President and Mrs. Lincoln. A third time I got in and I sat in a seat and I could see them down in front of me. But as fate would have it, I never saw President Lincoln being shot. There was one time where I was kept in that location long enough to hear the announcement that he'd been shot and the shock of the audience. And it was actually quite frightening for a child to be present in that setting because people were doing things like smashing chairs. They just really went crazy after they realized that their beloved Abraham, as they called him, had been murdered there up in the balcony. I didn't even see Booth may have walked past me at one point, but I certainly didn't see a gun in his hand. Now, we know that he was the leading actor of that time. He was considered the most handsome man in the United States. He was really a celebrity. He was sort of the Robert Redford of his time. And so I did not see John Wilkes Booth shoot President Lincoln. It may have been his wife. There was an Army officer named Major Rathbone, and his date that night were sitting next to the Lincolns. We know that Mrs. Lincoln was suffering from mental illness. Ladies in that era frequently carried a one-shot Derringer in their purses, especially a woman as prominent as the First Lady. And so what the intelligence community was asking me to do was to see if they could use chronovision to go back and solve historical mysteries like that. It was basically, it was training me in time travel, because certainly the children in Project Pegasus were going to go on in adulthood and be involved extensively in time travel in a time-space program under DARPA that would secretly rival the conventional space program under NASA. It would remain secret, and these time travel technologies would remain, sensitive, compartmentalized national security secrets as they do to this day, were it not for my truth campaign. So in being sent there, they were trying to see, well, can we send a child who would never even be noticed probably because of his youth or her youth? There were also girls involved in the program, an equal number of girls, I might add. And could they send them, for example, behind the Lincoln seating at Ford's Theater and see who shot President Lincoln? So the net effect of that was, however, that Project Pegasus proved the existence of the multiverse. The notion that we live in one universe, but it's a universe in which basically a multitude of timelines are going on simultaneously. Mm-hmm. The past, present, and future is happening now. And if you can find ways to tunnel through to another timeline, you basically experience being in that time and place, which is what they were doing with the chronovision. They were creating a field of supercharged particles that was so dense that the hologram was lensing. That's the term that my dad used. It was lensing past events or future events, usually past events. Most of my time travel the past, into the laboratory, so you could either see what was going on or you could enter the hologram physically and experience and directly interact with that time and place. So, for example, when we were being trained on the chronovisor in Morristown, which was the second location where they had one of these arrays that I was taken to, Jack Pruitt, who was one of the team leaders on Project Pegasus, who would go on, he was a Navy officer who would go on to be, according to Nichols and Moon, in their books about the Project Montauk, Jack Pruitt would go on to be the research director for Project Montauk. Well, I knew him as one of the team leaders 15 years earlier on Project Pegasus, and he explained that when we were being sent to those past times, we were there only as a spectral presence, as a ghost would be perceived in our time and place. But in addition to being able to send somebody back in time as a result simply of propagating a hologram, the second paradox that I would note was the fact that once they opened up that hologram, it was unbounded. It was essentially a portal into the past because, for example, when I was sent to Ford Theater and started walking towards the theater, I didn't butt my nose into the wall of the laboratory. It wasn't like a conventional virtual reality array. Mm-hmm. It was literally a pocket of time-space that they had opened up on a fourth-dimensional basis within the three-dimensional confines of the stage. Mm-hmm. So you could walk unlimited distance inside the hologram. So I did that extensively to that particular location in the summer of 1971. And then I was present at a meeting at the Sandia National Labs in the evening. There were about 20 or 30 project people present. My father had invited me and his longtime friend Connie Chavez from Albuquerque to that project meeting in the evening. And a very distinguished senior administrator of Project Pegasus stepped on the stage, and he said, "I regret to inform all of you that we've decided to shut down the time travel to the past involving the children in the chronovisors." And there was a groan throughout the room. And he said the problem with this form of quantum access is that every time we send the same child or another child to the same past event, the child's account that they're providing when we debrief them changes a little bit. So while they're gathering information about past events, it's not information that is providing actionable intelligence. It's not producing reliable data. So in light of the dangers involved and children, inherent dangers involved, and the unreliability of the data that they're gathering, we've decided simply to end that component of the program. But before they did, they clearly showed that we live in the universe where we're on a particular timeline, and other timelines are going on simultaneously that we can't perceive because they're basically walled off in the quantum hologram. It's like being in an office building where you might go up 3 flights and then make a left and go down a hallway to your office, but you'll never find out what it's like to go straight to the back of the building and up 5 stories and then go right down a hallway. You never really experience the totality of the different hallways and rooms in that building. You just experience sort of the timeline that you experience walking in some direction through that building or working in a particular area of the building. But if you were to tunnel through the hallway of your experience, you'd find out, hey, there's other people over in this other hallway or these other offices. So that's what the chronovision is doing. But unfortunately, or fortunately, unlike the teleporters, it was taking a sort of a random slice of the quantum hologram. And since these adjacent timelines are so deeply internested and embedded in each other, and in fact they only have slight variations of what's going on, when they set up one of these holograms and tried to access our timeline, but a certain number, for example, of years in the past, what actually was happening, they discovered, is they were going and getting another timeline. They were slicing through the hologram. It would be like slicing an onion and trying to remove the white part of the onion to put in your sandwich, but they were getting some of that, maroon onion skin that's inedible. They were basically slicing part of the quantum hologram that they didn't want to and lensing that into the laboratory. And as a result, they were not accessing the Lincoln assassination event as it informs our present. They were accessing a version of it that also exists with a multitude of versions of it in the quantum hologram. So that was really my first encounter with an American president. It was in 1971. My dad and I were staying in a rental house in Albuquerque that summer. And during those summers, we would teleport via the Tesla device that was at the old Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey. We would arrive in Santa Fe, and then we would do different things in New Mexico for days, weeks, and in the case of those summers, for the summer. And then we would drive down to Sandia via taxi, because we would drop the rental car, go up to Sandia and jump through an identical device there, and not just teleport back to New Jersey, but New Jersey at the beginning of the summer again. So by 1970, teleportation was being used for immediate time travel within the time envelope of the program. And they were actually using teleportation, using time travel via teleportation to hide the program, because we would spend all that time in New Mexico and then just jump back via teleportation, through one of these tunnels in time-space, not just back to the East Coast or our location where we had embarked from, but adjusted backward in time so that we were arriving a half hour or an hour after we had left. So I had basically an adventure there as a child during those 4 hidden summers in New Mexico. I was being trained in a learning lab at my elementary school during the year. We did do some things in New Jersey, like we were introduced to the technology. We did some of the chronovisor probes, but a lot of the activity was then saved for the next summer, where we teleported to New Mexico and did all manner of time travel from New Mexico.
Interesting. There's one question that I did have, just kind of a general one in a sense, but when you would go enter these sort of quantum rips or lenses, or how you want to phrase it, how would they bring you back after your objective was complete?
Well, the methodology of bringing somebody back was germane to the kind of device. For example, with the Tesla teleporters, they were opening up a vortal tunnel in the time-space continuum, and we were physically passing through it. And then when that tunnel closed, we were situated somewhere else on the face of planet Earth. Okay, so in that instance, when we were being physically repositioned in time-space, we needed an identical device to get back. So they were doing a series of short hops from Woodridge, New Jersey to Santa Fe, and then we were jumping back to Woodridge, New Jersey, literally to the tarmac there on the airfield at Curtiss Wright, via an identical device inside an identical room. They had actually mocked up the teleport at Sandia with even the same Dixie cup and a number 2 pencil sitting over on the windowsill. For some reason, I guess because maybe they thought the room had become an amplifier for the whole effect. So in the case of physical teleportation via these Tesla teleporters, we were only making short hops within the time envelope that demarcated the existence of the program. Because if, for example, we had been sent from 1971 to 1771 in Santa Fe, there was no way we were going to be getting back. We would have been lost in time. In fact, during our training in the summer of 1970, there was a segment of our curriculum about what we should do if we were accidentally dislocated in time. And it was explained to us that that might happen. They didn't know. And if it did, we should simply find the most responsible adults that we could find and ask to be adopted into their household. Find a Catholic priest at a mission, find a prominent settler family with children, find a sheriff or a military officer and explain the situation and ask to be adopted into a household and given chores, and survive that way. So the teleportation usually worked. There was one time when we were accidentally teleported to 1991 and we had to get back. But I always jumped through that device fearful that I might be literally lost in time. So it was a pretty frightening thing for a child to be doing regularly. I had to kind of buck up and just deal with the fear. And I ultimately did overcome that. So, talking about my experiences now is a piece of cake, because when you've time traveled as a 7, 8, 9, and 10-year-old, talking about your experiences is pretty easy. So now with some of the other devices, in the case of setting up the hologram with the chronovisor, there were really 2 things that could happen to get us back to the present. If we were in for fewer than 15 minutes, the hologram would simply start collapsing. It looks sort of like, a chalk painting on a Parisian sidewalk that was suddenly being melted by rain, kind of the Mary Poppins effect, how I kind of viewed it. And if that happened, we would start to see black objects, black body emanations popping into view around the stage, which would be the elbow, the shoulder, the kneecap of our fellow child time travelers. And then major parts of their body and heads and so forth would start popping into view. We would be stuck basically in a field of supercharged particles called scintillation for about 90 seconds. So we had exercises where we practiced counting back from 100 just to adjust to the fact that we were sort of in this field of swarming particles. It looked sort of like raster on a TV set for about 90 seconds. If we were in the chronovisor arrays for the hologram itself for more than 15 minutes, a density effect would occur. And what they were doing was inserting a portal into the hologram that was indicated by a white contraption that looked kind of like a soccer goal. So we had some exercises up at a local Army base running towards that goal that device that they called the portal. And when we did so, we were always trained to vigorously run towards it whenever it popped into view, because that was our ticket home. When we did so, we felt kind of a vacuum effect into the portal, and we found ourselves continuing to run through deeper and deeper sand. What they had done is they had attached that portal to the back of a dinosaur tunnel, a kind of a amusement park ride at a defunct New Jersey amusement park. And we would then run through that tunnel in the present, in 1971, for example, and there was a metal dinosaur at the mouth of that cave, and we would always tap him to just, convince ourselves we were back in 1971 and not the place that we'd actually gotten sort of holographically embedded in this kind of density effect. So those were the 2 means that got us back via chronovision. In the case of one of the time travel technologies that they were using, for example, that they sent me to Gettysburg, which was my second encounter with the subject of the U.S. presidency, when they sent me to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on November 19th of 1863, when President Lincoln gave his famous Gettysburg address from a dais there near the cemetery in Gettysburg, memorializing the battle that had taken place in July of that year, July 1st through 4th, in the summer of 1863. I was sent there via an entirely experimental technology that emerged around 1972 called plasma confinement. Our researchers had found that when you put plasma in confinement in a dense chamber, it creates another one of these disequilibriums in the time-space continuum. And in that instance, I actually walked into the field of plasma and violently wormholed, so that major parts of the Union Bugle Boy costume that I had been outfitted in at that location actually got wrenched off of me. I lost my hat, 2 shoes, and a sock. So when that technology put me down in a road to the northwest of the Southwest Arterial that still does, it goes right into downtown Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. I realized I only had 1 sock on, so I took that sock off, threw it into the bushes, and then walked into Gettysburg barefoot and shivering. It was cold that morning. And initially, in fact, it was kind of foggy, and it was very cold, and I was walking along the well-trammeled dirt road, presumably trammeled by, the Union Army. I was walking, south by southeast and then due south right into downtown Gettysburg to see Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address, and I was really in sort of an exposure event at that point. I was very cold and shivering. My teeth were actually violently chattering by the time I got into downtown. And I was helped there and shod with some grossly oversized shoes and a Union winter parka and a hat by a man that we've identified as John Lawrence Burns. John Burns was then about 70. In fact, before I even identified him, I described how he had this sour expression, but he was very hospitable to me. How he was hobbling severely on what looked like a recently wounded hip. How he had the skeleton key to the millinery shop in downtown Gettysburg and got me some shoes, so that's consistent with what we later learned, which is that he was the cobbler there working in downtown Gettysburg. And he had been a volunteer for the War of 1812, but he got wounded in the hip volunteering as a Union sharpshooter during the Battle of Gettysburg. So I ended up not seeing Lincoln, but I ended up seeing this other great American who was far less celebrated.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I actually posted there's actually a wiki on him. I went ahead and posted that in the chat room, and I was wondering because there's also an image of you too, correct, with the oversized shoes standing there.
Right.
And what was it?
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's actually what was the name of that picture again? I totally forgot it right now.
Well, what happened? Let me develop how that picture was taken. What ended up happening is I ended up being in the foreground of what until 2008 was the sole surviving photograph showing Abraham Lincoln in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on the day he gave his famous address there. That photograph surfaced in 1951 and was published in Life magazine in the early 50s, and then again in the early 70s, like sort of as 20 years ago in Life. That photograph basically emerged this way. What happened was Mr. Burns finally outfitted me with a hat, and I'm wearing these grossly oversized men's street shoes. They were like size 14 brown, just regular, conventional shoes, non-military civilian shoes. Mm-hmm. So he said, "Well, young man, that's the best I can do. The President of the United States is going to be in this town today, and I've got a speech to go to." So he hobbled out of the front of the millinery shop there on one of the main streets in downtown Gettysburg, and walked straight forward and to the left, because the dais was about a 30 by 100 foot raised platform, maybe about 4.5 feet off the ground, and with patriotic bunting around it, but nothing else. It was wide open, I guess because they wanted everybody to see the president. So I shuffled along in my shoes. I was virtually falling out of the tops of the shoes. He had packed packing paper in the front of the shoes, but they were still, I was still walking along like a child in his dad's slippers. I mean, I could hardly keep them on my feet. So he just stood there, kind of steadying himself on a cane, I believe, that he grabbed in the millinery shop. I went over to the left corner of the dais, and there were only about 4 or 5 people there at that point. This was very early in the morning, and Lincoln was expected to arrive, literally several hours later. And there were 2 young women dressed in their Sunday best over on the left side of the dais. And they were looking over at me and gossiping behind their fans. I imagine they were saying something like, "Well, look at this young carpetbagger. He's wearing adult street shoes, a Union parka, and a hat clearly from one of our brave, Union dead." Mm-hmm. Now, carpetbaggers weren't treated very kindly in the Civil War. They were chased out, they were shot at, they were tarred and feathered sometimes. So I had training to essentially avoid detection. So I wasn't thinking what might have happened to me as a carpetbagger. I now appreciate that dimension of what was going on. But they were literally staring at me in a hostile way and gossiping behind their fans. So I moved tactically to the center of the dais, literally dead center in front of the stage where Lincoln would be arriving later that day. And I turned to my left, and I realized there was a Pennsylvania farmer standing there. And then I realized it was my dad. But it was my dad at a younger age than he was when I had just left the plasma confinement chamber location in East Hanover, New Jersey. That was under the direction of Dr. Sterling Colgate, who was then the president of the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology. He was one of the major scientists involved in Project Pegasus. But I realized here in Gettysburg in 1863, my dad is standing there. I said, "Dad, what are you doing here? I thought you were back at the time lab." And he waited a bit, and then I said, "Dad, why aren't you talking to me?" And he said something like, I'm not your paw, son," kind of in a rustic Pennsylvania kind of accent. I'm not your father, son. And then my training kicked in. I thought, well, I better not pester my dad because he's trying to act like we're not father and son. So he must have been sent here at an earlier time. I then was so disturbed by that. I'm in 1863. My dad's there. He was just at the time lab in 1972 in East Hanover. So there was kind of some cognitive dissonance that was kind of confusing me. I then went to the left side of the dais again, and I was kind of abruptly stopped by two Union officers. One was he was mustachioed and sort of very handsome. He was leaning with his right elbow against the corner of the dais and sort of surveying the crowd, almost with a state of, look of bemusement. In front of him was a far cruder-looking officer. He was a junior officer, and he had a stubble on his face, and he was slicing an apple right in my face. And he bent down, and he began questioning me. Where's your regiment, boy? And I didn't know what my regiment was, and he said, well, you don't. Well, where are you bivouacked? And I said, what's bivouac, sir? And he turned to the other officer and said, this bugle boy doesn't know what bivouac means. And then he leaned forward again. Boy, have you seen a little bit too much of the fight? Are you a little bit touched in the head? Have you seen a little bit too much of the fight? And I said, yes, sir, hoping he would leave me alone. And then they laughed uproariously, which I think kind of shows some of the human toil or trauma of the Civil War. They were literally laughing about a shell-shocked, 10-year-old bugle boy. So I really was concerned that I was gathering too much attention to myself before Lincoln arrived on the dais. So I made a decision basically to evade what was going on. We had different kinds of intelligence training, and now it was basically time to skedaddle, to stay out of trouble. For example, to avoid being captured, because they were concerned that if we were captured and imprisoned, they wouldn't be able to necessarily extricate us from different situations, whether it was based on not being able to put the portal into a prison cell because it was too small, or, for example, some localized effect from, let's say, a cramped prison cell in terms of the effects of the quantum field effect that the plasma confinement was creating, which is the second technology. So we had clear instructions to always evade being captured, and I was concerned the Union officers were going to arrest me as a deserter because I couldn't tell them where my regiment was bivouacked. So I made a decision to walk about 100 paces away from the dais with my back to the crowd on the dais and my feet positioned with the left foot forward and the right foot to the right. So hopefully anybody who looked over at me wouldn't notice the grossly oversized adult shoes that I was wearing. And then I decided to look to my right with my back to the dais because I knew Lincoln would be arriving in an entirely different direction. He was going to be coming from the Wills Hotel, which was about 180 degrees in the opposite direction from where I was looking. And it was in that position that the quantum field effect from the plasma confinement chamber wore off. I felt this massive Kundalini-type sensation and a kind of a momentary lapse of consciousness, kind of almost like a religious metanoia sort of feeling, where I actually entered the altered state of consciousness, and I was back at the time lab in East Hanover, New Jersey, in 1972. But before that happened, before they brought me back or the effect wore off, as it were, I saw a man carrying something up a stepladder a number of feet in front of me, not that far in front of me, that I now realize must have been the photographer who took that picture that day. And that picture is called the Josephine Cobb image for the woman who found in 1951, when it was uncovered, as simply an historical photograph from the Civil War era, that when you examine a few of the pixels up on the dais, you can see a small image of Abraham Lincoln's head, his without his hat on, just his bare head, as he was sitting down on the dais. Now, that's actually been somewhat of a controversy regarding Gettysburg. It's always been speculated by American historians of the Civil War when the photo was taken. Well, I can verify that it was without question taken right after Abraham Lincoln stepped onto the dais, after walking over to it with David Wills, the proprietor of the Wills Hotel, and sitting down in his seat awaiting the proceedings. Because when I had just been over at the dais, he had not yet arrived on the dais. And since that photograph was taken so shortly after I walked towards where the photographer was setting up, to basically just evade what was going on, with my back to the crowd, that was only really several minutes before that I was taken back to 1972. So we know that now, I can provide the eyewitness testimony that image of the townspeople of Gettysburg gathering on and around the dais where Lincoln gave his famous address there that day was taken right after he arrived on the stage. I found that photograph in Life or another news magazine. We're still looking for the actual issue, but we know that Life has published a copy of that image with its logo and with the Life photo number, and that's been on the internet. We also know that after I began lecturing about my experiences in Project Pegasus, the Library of Congress took the complete Josephine Cobb image down from the internet and now is only showing a close-up of the crowd scene back on the dais in the background of the image, presumably to cut me out of history. But that's basically the upshot of that photograph. The only photograph until 2008, when a few more photos were discovered, that for so many years was the sole surviving photograph to show President Lincoln on the dais in Gettysburg, is also the first photograph that we know that captures a time travel from the future. And that was me after being sent there by Project Pegasus.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was actually able to find the image there and been posting it in the chat room, and we'll be posting it on universaltruthevolution.com in the archives too, so everyone can see the full image with you standing there right in the foreground with the big shoes.
Yeah. In fact, one of my research associates, Brett Stillings, is I believe the grandnephew of Josephine Cobb, and she's still alive. So we hope to interview her about her discovery of the image and the photo analysis that was done to find the image of Abraham Lincoln's face, basically, and part of his upper body, his shoulders, as he was sitting down. There's a man in a stovepipe hat next to him that's often confused for Lincoln, but he's actually slightly blurred and clearly sitting back in his seat and sort of looking down. His chin is sort of inverted downward. So I've had to come to terms with the fact that I was involved in something highly non-ordinary. And part of the spiritual quest of coming forward and telling the truth about my experiences in Project Pegasus has been not so much to convince others of my truth and have them believe me, but simply stand in my truth and tell it. Because I really can't control people's reactions to the information. It's true information, but I know that it's so far out that, even if I provided briefing documents that described how I was going to be retained or attached to Project Pegasus, people would analyze and they would scrutinize and try to debunk the signatures on the documents. So it's really pointless for me to prove my experiences to a scientific certainty. I think it's my responsibility, however, to share these experiences so other people can comprehend the fact that the U.S. government was already involved in sophisticated time travel probes in 1967-68, when the country was in the chaotic period that it was, with the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy, the war in Vietnam, the chaos surrounding the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. So during that period of incredible tumult in American history, perhaps the greatest violence since the Civil War, what the American people were not told is that secretly within this esoteric program within the councils of government of the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about us in his farewell address in 1961. The military-industrial complex was not just experimenting with time travel. The DARPA had achieved time travel and was even training children to be involved in it, both in childhood and then we would go on and be admitted to the Naval Academy. That was the plan. I didn't accept that appointment, but there was an attempt made to then have me apply to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, and as it had been explained by the defense attaché to the project, Donald Rumsfeld, in a conversation with my dad that I overheard, they were going to drop us into the Naval Academy and then use our commissioning in the U.S. Navy as a pretext for involving us in further time travel activities. So presumably some of peers in the program did enter Annapolis and have done more extensive time traveling since then. But, I'm speaking out simply so that people know that this happened, there's implications of it, and among other things, they've utilized the information that they've gathered from the future to brief the American presidents since around the time of the project. And that's something I thought we could also discuss, in this broadcast dedicated to quantum access and the U.S. presidency, which is the fact that I gathered through first-person experience on the project, the fact that in the early 1970s they began briefing future presidents and vice presidents on their destinies as a way, of psychologically preparing them for their later service in some of the top positions in the country. So it's kind of ironic that I had two exposures to Abraham Lincoln. I saw him, walking through the lobby of the Ford's Theater. I saw him once sitting in his chair up in the balcony, and then when I was sent literally as a kind of a privilege, a reward for serving well in the program for those 4 years, I found myself in that time lab in East Hanover with Dr. Colgate and my father asking me if I wanted to go and see Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. And even though I had already seen him, the idea of just standing there and watching Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address kind of overwhelmed me. I realized the significance of the setting. And a kind of a fear response ensued. And so they actually terminated the discussion at that point, and it brought me back 2 weeks later and asked me the same question. And I was literally sent to Gettysburg that morning. So it's ironic that, I had this exposure to several important days in Abraham Lincoln's life, and at the Gettysburg Address site, I ended up never seeing Lincoln. I interacted extensively with John Lawrence Burns. We know that it's me in the photograph because when I found the photograph in the early 1970s, actually, it had to have been 1972 because I was sent there in 1972, and when I found the image of myself at Gettysburg in what was probably an issue of Life, it could have been Look or the Sunday New York Times Magazine or some of the other magazines that we took at our house there in Morris Plains, New Jersey during those years. But I found the picture knowing I had been there. So that discovery had to take place in, let's say, summer of 72, because by November of 1972 we had moved to California when the Ralph M. Parsons Company moved to L.A. on its way to Pasadena. So that little interlude where I was sitting on the front stoop just on a lazy summer day, paging through old magazines, had to have taken place later in 1972, presumably the summer. And I took that photograph to my father. So presumably it was a weekend day, probably Saturday, or Sunday when he was reading his Sunday New York Times. And I took the magazine to my dad and said, "Dad, look, they got a picture of me when you sent me to Gettysburg." And he looked at it and he looked at it as if he had seen it before. And he said, "Yep, just don't talk about it." So they were really trying to carry out these time probes in a way where we wouldn't be detected, we wouldn't even be photographed. And I know that's the case because after I was essentially just automatically terminated from the project, in other words, when our period of service ended in 1972, a couple of years later I asked my dad, "Why didn't you send me to Dealey Plaza on November 22nd of 1963 to try to see who shot President John F. Kennedy, or at least see where the sound came from, or maybe be able to see a rifle, maybe in the grassy knoll or what have you?" And he said, "We couldn't." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you would have been photographed." They knew that there were so many still and motion picture cameras recording the assassination of John F. Kennedy that we would be detected in those, and they didn't want to risk the revelation of the program that way by people questioning, well, who is this little boy who suddenly pops into view here, in front of Abraham Zapruder or what have you.
Yeah.
But I did ask, and I was really concerned. I'm an admirer of President Kennedy, and I really think that was a great tragedy in the life of our country. And I really was concerned that they hadn't sent me there. As a 13, 14-year-old, I was thinking about it. I was almost asking my dad to see if they would send me, because the project still existed. It's just I was no longer working in it. So didn't get a chance to see JFK, but I did have a number of interesting encounters with future presidents, sort of on a social level in the program. And I think that's the next sort of material I'd like to go into to sort of establish how time travel technologies relate to the presidency, because we really are in a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, definitely. There was one question that I'd like to know too, and as well as those in the chat room, about some of the side effects that happen due to teleportation and time travel.
Well, the medical side effects were addressed by Secretary Rumsfeld during a meet and greet, during a kind of a lecture at the underground amphitheater at the Cerrillos Cultural Center site, where the Stargate device was placed and where the chronovisor was placed on the stage in that summer of 71 that I spent there. That facility is still there. It was built during the Great Depression by the WPA, and it's essentially a ramshackle, defunct public recreational facility. But there was an amphitheater where lectures were held 1 story below ground, and then that roof later burnt off. So if you walk inside the grounds of that facility, you can actually see where the amphitheater was, where Rumsfeld gave his meet and greet, and kind of this sequestered, underground intelligence community room that probably had sound absorbent materials in the walls and so forth. And what he said is that we've had some questions about medical side effects. And he said the only known medical side effect that we're aware of at this point is dehydration. We know that going through the Vortal tunnel produced by the teleporter is causing you to be very dehydrated when you reach Mexico, which in and of itself is already a very arid region of the country. So all that we can recommend is you take more trips to the water fountain and more trips to the bathroom. And then we all laughed. But what was not funny about it is when we were slaking our thirst at these water fountains at some of these locations, the kids were lining up and literally filling up their stomachs with water. I mean, there were occasions when I would be in line at the water fountain with the other teleportees, and a child would literally grab one of the kids and push them out of, away from the fountain. That happened right in the hallway outside that briefing room where Rumsfeld gave his talk to us, where he thanked us for our participation in the program, told us how proud our country and our family was of our patriotic service, and admonished us to keep the project technologies and activities absolutely secret because our national security depended on it. But Rumsfeld addressed the dehydration. When I spent the summer of 73 living in a rental house at White Rock, again with my dad, having access to summer of 73 via teleportation from the fall of 1971, by fall of 71 they were able to jump us about a year and a half into the future. My dad was giving me a big pill that he called a horse pill. And one time I overheard a quiet conversation between him and Connie at that house where he said, "We're giving Andy this big horse pill in the morning. We hope it'll overcome the effects of the teleportation." So they knew that the teleportation at a minimum was affecting the hydration and the metabolic functioning of us. One of my fellow teleportees, Glenn Pruitt, the son of Jack Pruitt, unfortunately, sadly, died in 2006 from pulmonary edema and congestive heart disease after reaching 700 pounds. When I met with his father and Glenn, when Glenn was still alive, in my first fact-finding trip to New Mexico, which was undertaken in June of 2003, Jack Pruitt apprised me of the fact that the dehydrational effects of the teleportation was causing the child teleportees in adulthood, that's basically my cadre of participants, to develop a disease that mimics diabetes. So what I've been doing is everything that you should do to combat type 2 diabetes, and I've been controlling my weight. Sometimes I jump up a little bit, extra 10 or 20 pounds, but then I fight back to drop them. Basically, I'm hydrating all the time. You saw where I actually started coughing here during this interview. If I talk a lot without drinking water, my throat dries out. I still am sort of chronically dehydrated. But I'm doing the things you need to do. I'm counting my carbs. I'm avoiding all high glycemic foods when I can do that. And when there's not a piece of wedding cake in front of me. I'm exercising. I'm hydrating. I'm taking a magnesium and a potassium supplement. I'm drinking alkalized water, being marketed by the Glacier Water Company of Auburn, Washington, which has a phenomenal alkalized glacial water that has really been helping me hydrate. And essentially also taking about an hour nap a day on a biomat so that my body is permeated with far infrared, which is also known to have an effect to limit blood glucose levels. But I've gotten up pretty high sometimes, and I pretty much have fought my way back to 90 or 100. What is it? It's milligrams of glucose over deciliters of blood. So I basically have to avoid, the diabesity crisis that the whole country's suffering. Not just the child teleportees from Project Pegasus, but the American people are suffering a public health crisis, which involves the interlinkage between diet, lifestyle, the lack of exercise, obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. That's the number one health cost in the country. All of those maladies from the same pattern of weight gain and high blood glucose levels and the attendant health effects. We know that diabetes and heart disease and even cancer can't flourish in an alkalized body. So a major part of my attempt to control for the exposures that I had in the project is simply to alkalize. So I'm drinking this alkalized water all day long. Regarding the adult participants, I learned in my father's experience with heart disease, and then in a briefing regarding this issue with Courtney M. Hunt, who was my contact officer to the CIA in the 1980s and 90s, the adult participants were developing heart valve defects because the valves in their heart, the tissue was too rigid. So the teleportation experience was causing, for example, the unique valves of the mitral valve in my dad's heart kind of fused in a butterfly effect. Wow. So when he had his first open heart operation in 1978 at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, Dr. Sestitis, who was the prominent Argentinian cardiac surgeon who operated with my dad, came out and asked us why my dad would have this heart defect. He wanted to know if he had a heart infection in childhood and so forth. So that was one of the dangers that was happening to the adult participants. So a lot of the adult teleportees have either died or have had open heart surgery to correct some of the malformation of their heart valves. Wow. But those are the only medical side effects that I'm aware of. There was an instant. There were really two of the 140 American school children involved. There were two casualties. One was a little girl who looked up at the crystal array in the chronovisor and became blind. The light was so bright, it literally destroyed the visual cortex. Wow. The other accident that happened to my peers in the project was one time we teleported from different locations in the Midwest and East Coast in a kind of almost like you would do in a parachute invasion from different planes during wartime. They were having kids jump through the devices from different locations, and it was our task to basically race to a particular location in Santa Fe. And as we weren't up at the state capitol grounds during this arrival. We were in sort of like a defunct school property, maybe an abandoned junior high school. And as I ran between two of the bungalows, I heard somebody screaming in pain. And then as I stopped, I looked at a public fountain in which I could see 2 feet shod in red Keds sneakers. And next to the fountain was a boy my age, about 9 years old, writhing on the ground without any feet, screaming, my feet, I'm only 9 years old. What am I going to do without any feet? And by the time I arrived there, one of the male team leaders arrived and pinned him to the ground. And then 2 female team leaders appeared with walkie-talkies, and then one of them grabbed me by the shoulder and ran me away from the scene. shouting, you didn't see this, Andy. It didn't happen. You didn't see it. It didn't happen. They then took me to a doctor's office where I was given a sedative via a hypodermic needle in the backside. It was actually quite painful. It was a big needle. And then my dad arrived, and he took me into Albuquerque, and we just kind of hung out in some of our favorite places there for the rest of the day. So another reason I'm speaking out is because, American school children born in that period in the late 50s and early 60s where I and my siblings were born, where many of my lifelong friends were born, I think because children sacrificed so mightily to provide the U.S. civilization a time-space capability that we can now use to help the entire world, that I'm ethically bound to talk about the project so that we know historically that these great sacrifices were made in the furtherance of science and applied science, and the betterment of the present by being able to do creative things related to the past and the future. So I'm speaking out on behalf of that little girl who lost the ability to see, and on behalf of that little boy who was my contemporary who lost his feet and has been living ever since, presumably on prosthetic feet.
Definitely. Well, it's customary for us to take a little short break here at the top of the hour anyway, so it might be a good time to rehydrate then, and for everyone else out there as well. And then we can go ahead and get into more of the subject matter that you wanted to, as well as I was hoping we can talk a little bit about Mars too. So
great.
Yeah, awesome. So, all right, everyone, go grab yourself a drink. Well, hopefully it's some tasty alkalized water as well. It's great stuff for our body and does awesome for rehydration. Okay, that's my unsolicited commercial for the day. And here we go. Enjoy, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Hope you are nice, well rejuvenated, and rested here for our second almost hour of Universal Truth Evolution on Blog Talk Radio. We have ourselves quite an awesome guest today here with Andy Basiago, and quite a bunch of information to get to. So how's it going there, Andy? How was the break?
Excellent, yes.
Great.
I drank some more water, so I'm good to go.
Yeah, awesome. I was rehydrating there myself. So yeah, I know you said you wanted to touch upon some particular topic right now. So by all means, if there's anything that jumps out at you.
Yeah, Project Pegasus wasn't primarily a time travel technical development project. The technologies had already been developed. I mean, they were quasi-experimental. I mean, clearly, the incident in which the boy lost his feet teleporting because somebody had left water there, they knew that might happen if water was present at one of the locations where we were popping into view. So they couldn't control for the utter safety of what we were doing. But the technologies had already emerged. I mean, I first teleported to Santa Fe from the old Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company location with my dad sometime between September of 1967 and 68, because when we then got to Santa Fe and drove into a meeting with Dr. Harold M. Agnew, one of the Manhattan Project physicists, when he was then the director of the W Division, the Weapons Division at Los Alamos. He asked my father my age, and we both said 6. So we know from that teleportation was operational between September 18th of 1967 and September 18th of 1968.
Wow.
We also know that the chronovisors had been under development by the Vatican musicologist Ernetti and Gemelli, with later assistance from the distinguished Italian physicist Enrico Fermi in the 1940s. They had a two-dimensional chronovisor by 1952 as a result of their discoveries at the Catholic University of Milan. Now, we also know that a variety of different sources of different time travel technologies was going into the intelligence funnel that DARPA's Project Pegasus essentially was. I mean, they were clearly placing what they knew from reverse engineering extraterrestrial devices. For example, the Montauk chair that you sat in essentially bumped you as a result of magnetic transduction to an episode, a moment in your own subjective future, as it were, in all likelihood was reverse engineered from the pilot's seat in extraterrestrial or interdimensional spacecraft. Or I like to say not extraterrestrials and spaceships, but interdimensionals and time ships, because that's probably what they are. Yeah. So that device is probably extraterrestrial in origin, but my father and Jack Pruitt and Dr. Robert Beckwith, all of whom were principals on the project, explained to me at different times in different ways that the principal debt of gratitude was owed the project to Nikola Tesla, because he had left a number of time travel devices in his papers at the time of his death in 1943 that were seized by the War Department and forwarded to the physicists that were then gathering in Los Alamos to build the atomic bomb. So you had the Tesla legacy, the Ernetti and Gemelli legacy on a different line of technical development, the commonality being the linkage to Enrico Fermi, because Fermi not only became Ernetti and Gemelli's research partner on chronovision, he was the mentor to Dr. Agnew at the University of Chicago when they were working on the Manhattan Project. So really, Enrico Fermi is really the principal interstitial personality that is often attributed to Albert Einstein or John von Neumann in the conventional time travel literature. Fermi probably was a critical figure. And of course, a distinguished physicist like that would have to be to understand the relationship between the devices and quantum mechanics. So we're talking about not only extraterrestrial sources and the work of brilliant Earthlings like Tesla and Ernetti and Gemelli, but also obviously they were gathering information from the activity in the time-space continuum undertaken by ancient civilizations. We think that the Sumerian, the Babylonian, and the Egyptian civilizations may have mastered teleportation. Some of their hieroglyphics seem to indicate that, where people are seen jumping through 2 pillars. The Native American experience with spontaneous teleportation through natural mineral deposits that have been magnetized and created distortion in the time-space continuum. Clearly, they were placing that data into the intelligence funnel, along with undoubtedly Nazi German technology and and current Soviet technology, because I know, as a result of my 10-year investigation, that the former Soviet Union was also experimenting with teleportation. In fact, the American people deserve to know that it was as a result of our time travel capability that we won the Cold War, because we were doing things like having people teleport across country, stay there for several years, gathering information about future events, and then teleporting back to the day they left 2 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And using that as a way of gathering information about immediate future events to conduct national security-related logistical planning. They were also taking sensitive military secrets that the Soviet spies might steal or pay for or whatever, find, and jumping them several years into the future, so that if the Soviet Union found out about some of our advanced technologies, they wouldn't be able to get to them.
Mm-hmm.
So there was one instance where my dad and I arrived at Curtis Wright to teleport from fall of 71 to what I ultimately learned was summer of 73 when we got there, where he was given a big mailing tube by an Army colonel. And when I asked him what was in the tube, he said, schematics to some of our most sensitive weapons systems. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, the plans to our next generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles. So Project Pegasus can be conceived of not just as a time travel development project. It clearly was a classified research and development project. I mean, what we were doing was new and experimental. But by the time I was placed in it officially in the fall of 1969, a lot of the technologies had already emerged, and they were using children for functions like testing the teleportation on their mental and physical functioning, to use us as participant observers in the chronovisors because our perceptions were unbiased by our previous experience. They were training us to be a cadre of chrononauts in the future. And they also needed small, cooperative, bright children to be participants because in some cases, for example, the size of adults would make the holograms blink out and prevent them from using the holograms to explore past events when we started that in earnest in fall of 70. So it was a time travel technical development project, but even more so, it was an intelligence gathering project. I read a DARPA circular published during that era that was entitled Remote Sensing in Time. And it was explained to us that beyond us mastering time travel, getting familiar with the different forms of quantum access that we were being exposed to, we were really involved in an intelligence project that was trying to get better information about past and future events to enable the executive branch to engage in a superior form of logistical planning for current events and immediate future events. So really, they were eager to find out what the next year or two held, or let's say who the next several presidents would be. Mm-hmm. Because their principal concern was survival and peace in the nuclear age. The two primary threats that they didn't know what would happen, they were concerned about, I speak of as the Greys and the Reds. They didn't know what the extraterrestrials wanted. That began visiting us in earnest after we began doing the cosmically stupid thing of blowing up atomic bombs and literally destroying part of the physical substrate of the time-space continuum. I mean, literally creating tears in time-space by detonating nuclear fission devices. But they also were concerned that the Soviet Union would leap ahead technically and maybe even try to launch a physical invasion of the continental United States. They were concerned about Soviet ships landing Soviet Army soldiers on American soil, and so they wanted to go into the past to see what had given rise to current conditions. For example, at a certain location that might be of military significance. Or in the development of technology by the Soviet Union. Oh, we found this in our satellite image. Let's see what was there 2 years ago. Let's see what will be there 2 years from now. And in that sense, creating this quantum access-based intelligence program, one of the things that I know to a personal and a historical certainty is that they were trying to ascertain who the future leaders of the United States would be, our presidents and vice presidents, so they could inform them in real time of their destinies, decades in advance of their periods of service as president and vice president, so that they could psychologically prepare for the overwhelming personal experience of being asked to serve as one of the leaders of the United States, and hence one of the leaders of the free world. The principal leaders, publicly speaking at least, of the free world. I remember that President Harry Truman said that when he learned that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had died and that he was soon going to be sworn in as President of the United States, he felt as if the weight of the entire world had been placed on his shoulders and his feet were being driven into the ground. So we have to appreciate the fact that clearly many confident and capable people have run for president, and some very capable people have served as President of the United States. In fact, I think to the extent that our presidents have been selected during this 225-year, 230-year period here, where the United States was in political, economic, and military ascendancy, I think you could craft an argument that some very remarkable human beings have become President of the United States. Certainly very capable and ambitious and confident individuals. But that doesn't mean that they're not individuals with a central nervous system, with an affective nervous system, and with shortcomings and insecurities. And so I think that the think tank people and the historians working with our defense officials said, all things being equal, it would probably promote survival and peace in the nuclear age, to the extent that who's president could be so controlling of what happens during a certain presidential administration. For that 4-year period of history, we're relying a lot on those several individuals that are governing the executive branch and hence the country. It would be better if they knew in advance so they could just simply get their mind around that destiny and cope with it when it happened. And so how do I know that's been going on? Well, I know through many forms of direct personal experience that I'm now furnishing the evidence of. The first time I heard of a future president was in the period in mid-1971, where because they had identified me as the future whistleblower regarding Project Pegasus, and somebody destined to be a leading figure in this truth movement that would emerge, and that would become as significant as the abolition movement in terms of affecting the course that the U.S. takes historically. Initially, I became sort of persona non grata in the project. They were investigating me. So once they shut down Time Travel to the Past involving chronovision after that meeting at Sandia, they tasked my father to begin taking me to the Sandia labs, where they were calling up chronovisor generated images of moments in my subjective future. And he was asking me to use my psychic ability, my basic intuition about my future, to say, well, who's that person? Who's that person? And sometimes I was able to say who it was, even though it hadn't happened yet. I was a very psychically gifted child. And that was, in fact, the children in Pegasus were originally brought into the project because we were the child remote viewers in the U.S. Navy's remote viewing program. That was essentially our first set of activities. So many of us who went on to the time travel experiences were just really profoundly psychic. And the reason they were doing that is they wanted to chart my future, to say, well, why did this one kid out of 140, we know he's raised kids, so he saw a lot of the social environment of the program. He was invited to a lot of lunches and dinners that the other kids didn't see. He was at some of the labs and settings that the other kids didn't see because he was with his dad. His dad was one of the project principals. He was the youngest kid. He was the kid with one of the best memories when we tested him out. But why did this little boy end up growing up and becoming such a troublemaker, becoming such an iconoclast who would basically tell the world about how the U.S. government achieved time travel under the aegis of DARPA during those years? And so one of the things they were doing, in addition to having my dad ask me about these scenes from my future at one of the time labs at Sandia, was they began sourcing books that I would write or edit in the future and bringing them back. So in 1971-72, my father and Connie Chavez were literally reading the book that I'm still writing about my experiences in Project Pegasus. In fact, one time she was in possession of the book, and we were driving back from a barbecue in Laney, New Mexico, to drop Connie off at her home in northwest Albuquerque, and then drive back up to the rental house in White Rock. So that must have been summer of not of 71, but of 73. And Connie turned to my father, holding the book in her hand. She was in the front passenger seat. I was in the back. My dad was driving. And said, Ray, you got to appreciate the fact that your son's a human vacuum cleaner. And my dad said, what do you mean by that, Connie? I don't understand what you mean. And she said, well, I'll be reading the book. I'll be reading his book from the future. and I'll read something, and then it happens, and it's exactly what we said. And they said, well, give me an example. And she opened the book at random, and she read the passage in which I had written later about her having the conversation in the car with my dad coming back from the barbecue at Laney. So she was literally in this refractory experience where she was now telling him what the book was telling of. The book having been written in the future and taken back. Kind of like when you stand in a barbershop, and one mirror reflects the other, which reflects the other, and it goes to infinity. She was so disturbed now by this recoil, this sort of ontological shock of reading a book in which your actions are being depicted, but it's from the future, and you have it in your hands before it was even written, and it's telling about you. So she actually slammed the book shut. She was so disturbed by that. And she said, that's what I mean, right? It's bizarre. She said, your son is clearly brilliant because he's remembering little conversations we had, and it's the exact word. Well, that is, in fact, a measure of the degree of memory work that I've done. I've spent 10 years going back. I mean, I've sometimes sat in my writing chair on a Saturday morning and reflected on a certain episode from 9 o'clock to noon and remembered one additional detail, like so-and-so was at that project location, or that's exactly what Rumsfeld said during the meet and greet, and so forth. I have really worked my memory to allow what actually happened to surface. So my point here is that I was immersed in the cult of intelligence. So they weren't particularly happy to learn that one of the kids who was moving through the program and being pushed forward towards the most advanced activities, who also happened to be the youngest son of the CIA's point guy between Parsons and the CIA on teleportation, was now sort of inside their camp, the person who would grow up and spill the beans. So they began sourcing my book. So the first book that I would later write or edit in the future that they were in possession of, Lambermont Weber's book, Exopolitics, Politics, Government, and Law in the Universe. That was the book based on the seminal treatise about exopolitics that Alfred wrote in 2000 and posted on the internet, which is really the real sort of his vade mecum of his thinking about exopolitics, that then was edited by myself in 2005, and he published under his Universe books in Imprimatur. That is the definitive book about exopolitics. And Jerry, are you there? I got to.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Good.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And actually, our chat room is just going wild to hear about Mars. Actually, they seem to.
Okay. Well, let me take you through the presents quickly. So basically, there was a discussion at the table there about President Jimmy Carter because Alfred put a quotation by President Carter in the front pages of that book. So Connie said to my dad when he pulled it out of this black security satchel, I guess from the archive there in New Mexico from which it had been taken, she said, "Who's Jimmy Carter?" Okay, so that's the first time I heard the name of one of the future presidents. There was an incident at lunch that George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush were at, in which George W. Bush was all over that restaurant at the tables where project people were sitting, joking, "Have you heard? My daddy and I are going to be president." He said that right in front of my face. When he found out what my name was and discerned that I was the son of one of the guys from Parsons, my dad, he got right in front of my face and he said, "Andy, have you heard? My daddy and I are going to be president." So I had this keen image, this vivid image of a George W. Bush at 24, 25 years old telling me that he had just learned that he and his father were going to be president. We had a quiet lunch, but a very convivial lunch with a young Bill Clinton over on the left side of the La Hacienda restaurant, where he was still very thin. I don't even know if he was out of Georgetown at the time. It may have been around the time before he went over and was a Rhodes Scholar over at Oxford in the UK. But it was not even a Bill Clinton who was as hirsute and bearded, let's say, as we see in the pictures of Bill Clinton at Yale Law School. It was a younger Clinton than that. So that must have been, I don't know, 1970, 1971, right as he was transitioning to Oxford. I think he graduated from Georgetown in 69. It may have even been earlier. But we had lunch with this very young Bill Clinton, which he was just saying, "Well, I know you guys are telling me the truth, and I understand who you are in the atomic research community and the defense technical community, but I just really can't believe it. I get up and I say, are these guys really, are are they really goofing on me here? Am I really going to be president? And then I say, well, they must know. I mean, they some of them are the Manhattan Project scientists, so I better believe them. Okay, so Clinton was a prize during that time. There was a lunch in which Richard B. Cheney was brought into lunch, and that was him in the context of him sitting there with all the project people. There was a statement made by Connie Chavez one time when we were at the teleport in Solon, Ohio. If we would jump back and forth between New Jersey and New Mexico and the teleport tunnel would start to basically weaken, they could detect that and they would decant us to this grassy area across the intersection from the grounds of the Swagelok headquarters in Solon, Ohio, which actually, coincidentally, I think that's in Dennis Kucinich's district. I've met Dennis, and I want to actually apprise him of what went on in this district so many years ago involving time travel. But we were walking from that grassy area, that park, across the intersection and through the parking lot of Swagelok, because on the right side of Swagelok, which is a big one-story headquarters of their precision pipe fitting factory, over on the right side there was a room with one of the teleport devices. That the people at Swagelok were just ignoring our entry into the building. And we would then jump through that to get to New Mexico or get on our way to New Jersey. So we were walking through the parking lot, and I was walking ahead of my dad and Connie Chavez. And she said, Ray, many people in the project have said that one of our next future presidents is going to be this young man named Bill Clinton. Tell me, is it true? And my dad said, yep, that's what they say. Now, of course, my dad may have already, we may have already been at that lunch with young Bill Clinton. Mm-hmm. And then, so I didn't learn anything about their prior knowledge of the Ford or Reagan presidencies, but I also know that Barack Obama was apprised of his presidency by age 20 because in a completely serendipitous event, when I was at UCLA at age 20 myself, I'm about a month younger than President Obama, I was introduced to him in the rental house of a white South African anti-apartheid activist who was hosting him as a fellow activist in the anti-apartheid movement. When President Obama was in Los Angeles in the spring or summer of 1982 school break period, visiting his friends, as he put it, hanging out with his friends from Occidental College. Mm-hmm. And at the end of that conversation, his friend from South Africa said to me, we had started to argue about the impact that corporations would have on political economy during our lifetime. His friend admonished me, you better be nice to Amanda because he's going to be president of the United States someday. And I said something flippant like, oh, well, maybe we'll both pitch against each other in a World Series. And he said, no, you don't understand what I'm saying. I'm telling you, we know he's going to be president. He pointed up to President Obama, who was then walking up the staircase in the interior of the rental house. And Barack Obama looked at me and shrugged his mouth sort of, he kind of made a kind of a haughty gesture with his mouth and shook his head, not in a menacing way, but simply in a kind of a knowing way, telegraphing to me, communicating to me that what his friend was saying was true, that he knew he was affirming the truth of what his friend was saying. So here we have a situation where, in addition to serving in the time-space program at the time of its emergence, I have an historical duty, one that I think sounds in the oath of attorney that I took when I was sworn in as an attorney in the state of Washington in 1996, and that was to uphold the U.S. Constitution. It was not within the contemplation of the framers of the Constitution that something like time travel would emerge that would enable the permanent secret government to know who would be president and vice president in the future and inform those individuals in the present of their political and personal destinies. And I think that has caused a constitutional crisis of substantial magnitude. It means that when the presidents of this generation, namely Clinton, Bush, and Obama, certainly when they announced for the president, they had known for over 20 years that they were going to be president. They had the winner's confidence of the winner. Many people have commented on that, like the presidents Clinton, Bush 43, and Obama were behaving as if they knew they were going to be president, that they were the winner. And people said, well, they were just the most confident individuals. And they ended up being the most capable debaters and campaigners and so forth. I'm not saying they didn't legitimately earn their offices by running for the primaries and, primary nomination and then for the presidency. I'm saying that they had a special advantage that is outside of the constitutional schema by which the framers determined and that we've been operating under for over 200 years, which is it should be a spontaneous contest among equally treated contestants. There should not be an inner advantage. There shouldn't be an inner party such as is articulated in George Orwell's 1984 that has better information than the people in the outer party or the public, which is even kept outside the ring of the outer party. This is what Orwell predicted, and this, in fact, I believe, is what time travel technology has caused the emergence of, a situation where the tail is wagging the dog, where the CIA is in control of the presidency, at least to the extent of having a major influencing role in the lives and the thought processes of those who would not just seek the presidency but win it. So that was basically my encounter with the modern presidents, not as ironic as what happened relative to President Lincoln, but I have to share this with my fellow Americans because I believe that I'm ethically bound to do so as a result of pledging to uphold the U.S. Constitution when I was sworn in as an attorney in Clark County, Washington on November 15th of 1996. And so that's the primary reason I'm speaking out, but also, I mean, there would be ways to control this. We could, for example, create a law that anybody who's in possession of future information about who would become president would be guilty of a federal felony if they transmitted it to anybody. We could actually legislate this out of existence, at least presumably. But then that gets us into the vagaries of how we control the secret behavior of the intelligence community. So we're really in a dilemma here, and I believe they were in a dilemma, but they determined that in the same way that they apprised me of my later role articulating the life forms on Mars, the discovery of life on Mars, if you will, going up there and so forth, they made a decision to bend some of that information from the future back to the present so that when those individuals reached the White House, they would perform at their optimum. I don't think that's necessarily a bad decision, practically speaking, logistically speaking, but in terms of the integrity of our Constitution, I think it's been a disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. And you made mention of your involvement and your role in terms of blowing the whistle on life on Mars there. And I know the teleportation works into that as well as a lot of other concepts. I know we don't have a whole bunch of time, and that's a huge subject on its own. But if you would, I know I have some questions about, like, what's the surface of Mars like?
Well, I went up there twice. I talk about my experiences in Project Pegasus. The Mars jumps don't really include that because, Pegasus was a classified research and development program. So when I left in 1972, a lot of the experimentation was already well developed. I had then had a very ordinary and happy junior high and high school period in Los Angeles, California, and I was approached in the summer of 1981 by Courtney M. Hunt, not only of the Hunt family, but of the CIA. And the question that he asked me is, do you want to go to Mars? And I had the same trepidation about Mars as I did about the one jump to go see Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. I wasn't concerned about how I would emotionally respond to what I saw. In the case of Mars, I guess I was concerned that I would teleport somewhere and then my feet would be stuck upside down on another planet, with the Earth above my head somewhere. It was just a kind of a disorienting kind of proposition. It was racinating to contemplate being on another planet rather than on our home planet. So I initially declined, and then I said, he kept on pressing me and said, well, look, give me the answer I want to hear, basically. He ultimately ended up saying, you don't have a choice. I'm really just asking you so you say yes because you're going. And I said, why do I have to go? And he said, because the survival of human life depends on it. And I said, really? And he said, yes. And I never really stopped to ask him, do you mean in a general sense that young people have to be willing to become chrononauts and go off planet, just as the astronauts have been? Or do you mean that there's something about my destiny that there's some kind of intrinsic, chain in the great chain of being that needs to be edified by me now going to Mars? I think that's what it may have been, because as I articulated in my interview, a conversation with Andrew D. Basiago that Jessica Mystic of Vancouver, BC did, which has now gotten 1 million hits on YouTube, and I released that for free because I wanted this Mars information to be known. There were really 7 instances between 1968 and 2008 when I published my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, where the U.S. intelligence community contacted me in some way, whether it was through my father or Courtney Hunt or others to keep me on the right path relative to discovering life forms in NASA image PIA 10214. That photograph, the analysis of that photograph, is the basis of my landmark paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency was so aware of my future Mars work that one of the non-ordinary experiences I had when I was serving on Project Pegasus as a child is my father gave me a 2008 edition of that paper when it came out in the future. In other words, he had the 2008 paper as a quantum artifact. And in the fall of 1971, he had me read it. And when I asked him, why do I have to read my paper, Dad, he said, because when you write it, we want it to contain as much data about Mars as possible. And I would urge your listeners to ponder the vagaries of that. That suggests that they were trying to make sure that in this timeline, they were enriching the future paper with whatever the future could tell about the paper. And it's kind of like a mirror effect again. I think that's similar to telling the presidents of their destinies so they perform optimally as presidents. So sort of an analogy there. So that, as I articulate in the discussions with Jessica Schaub in her Jessica Mystic series, they wanted to keep me on track. They were sort of green-lighting me because they realized, I guess, that ultimately human civilization on Earth, knowing that its neighboring planet, Mars, is inhabited is important because that, in fact, is the real nature of our solar system. And that probably will work somewhat of a new Copernican revolution in terms of understanding not only that we're orbiting the sun and we're not the center of the cosmos, even as the sun is not the center of the vast cosmos, but that we are not the only inhabited planet in our solar system. So that may cause us to achieve perhaps a new standard of responsibility as we start traveling out even more, both through conventional propulsive spaceships and also through different time travel technologies, and begin exploring the solar system and the wider cosmos. I think they had identified it as something significant because I was apprised of even my findings at a very young age. For example, the humanoid being that I found on Tsiolkovsky Ridge, I was shown in a one-off presentation by my dad in the summer of 1969, I believe. So as quantum access was emerging, they had clearly prioritized this whole issue of what this current generation of Mars anomalists, including myself, are finding in NASA's images. And I think that's going to have a revolutionary effect on our culture, just that fact, that discovery. Why they had me go up in 1981, I think it was to acclimate me to some of the life forms on Mars that I would later find in the NASA images, and just have the experience of knowing what Mars is like, which was your question. Mars has a predominantly rust-red terrain, very similar to Sedona, Arizona. But there are other colored soils. There's sort of a pumpkin-colored soil, a kind of a cream-colored soil. So it's not uniformly rust-red. There are other browns and tans in the soil. Likewise, the rocks, some of which look like debris from space, in some cases you can see sort of igneous rocks, not just sedimentary or metamorphic, but actual things that look like ejected from outer space. Because we know the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC hit Mars with some very substantial objects from outer space. Now, some of the rocks, therefore, are multicolored, and the coloration of those I would direct to, for example, the mask of Tutankhamun, the bust of Nefertiti that Borchardt found in Amarna, Egypt in 1912. That high Egyptian civilization that built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx was on the surface of Mars. And some of the colors of the rocks of Mars entered the high Egyptian civilization via cultural diffusion. I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm sure that the Egyptologists might disagree with me. But my premise is that Mars was a colony of Earth, not the other way around. Because Earth is far more fertile and abundant with life support than Mars was, presumably even before the solar system catastrophe that damaged both Earth and Mars severely. So you get colors on the rocks that you find in the beautiful inlay of that of the artwork and funereal masks and so forth of that high Egyptian civilization. Colors like a kind of a turquoise blue, a kind of a cerulean or dark navy blue that's very beautiful, a kind of a blood red or pomegranate color, a very beautiful lime green or light lime green that I've identified as sort tropical frog, light green, different colors of turquoise, and a kind of a drab red, kind of a blood red. And these kind of colors that you see they were actually sort of showing, I think, part of the Martian leadership class potentially in their artwork. Some of those colors I have found in some of the artifacts on Mars. In fact, the sarcophagus of a pharaoh that's sitting on the far right edge of the home plate plateau, as depicted in PIA 10214, if you scrutinize the color schema of that object closely enough, you find the identical colors, for example, in Nefertiti's bust. So it's by no means a monochromatic planet on the surface. It is, however, primarily denuded of vegetation. All I saw during my 2 sojourns there, one for about an hour in July of 81 via a jump room in El Segundo, California, that we've linked to Hughes Aircraft, was just simple vegetation on the surface, like grasses and sedges and worts, like you'd find popping up from the ejecta from a relatively recent volcanic eruption on Earth. We're talking baby grass, little clovers and sedges and just basic vegetation. That's all I saw. I didn't even see trees. I did see one thing that was sort of a cross between a plant and animal life forms that I'm not really sure was a plant. It may have been a colony of animals that was more tulip-shaped, a little bit more flower-like. We had an encounter with a human-alien hybrid who had the upper extremities of a bald, muscular man and the lower extremities of a grub. On that second trip with Courtney Hunt, I went up the first time by myself in July of 81, and that second trip with Courtney in August of 81, we were actually chased back to the portal that we were using to get to the underground location where the jump room was. The jump room infrastructure was waiting to take us back to Earth. We were chased by the creatures on Mars, and I'm calling them plesiosaurs. I don't know whether they're from the plesiosaurus species that existed on Earth before the KT extinction, but I'm calling them plesiosaurs because they have basically bulky bodies that are kind of boulder-like and then long necks. And this thing started chasing us towards the skull on the surface that we were walking through to get down to a staircase in the underground location. So there are life forms on the surface. Some are predators. When I asked Courtney, is that a predator? He said, hell yes, that's a carnivore. And I said, how do you know? Because it's really just a big blob of flesh with a neck on it, like the Loch Ness Monster, as it were. And he said because it has teeth all the way, it has razor-sharp teeth all the way down its throat. Okay, I don't know why the indigenous humanoid civilization on Mars, one part of which are clearly our long-lost relatives from the time before the solar system catastrophe when we had a colony on Mars, I don't know why they've kept predators on the surface like that. It may be simply because they're taking part in a multi-generational program to refertilize the soil to make Mars a more verdant planet. But there certainly are predators on the surface, and when humans are isolated on the surface, far away from a portal, they're pretty much fair game. That's one of the disturbing things we're finding in the NASA images from Mars, is that there are predators on the surface, and hence they do consume human beings. And hence the disturbing fact biologically is that on Mars, humans don't regularly occupy the top of the food chain. And that's something I think that is the reason for the cover-up of life on Mars, the fact that it's inhabited, the fact that it has a bizarre ecosystem, and the fact that we have an expanded presence there. I was in that culture of aerospace engineers when I was being raised by my father and when I was serving in Project Pegasus. My dad had worked in the 1950s on designing the metal alloy for the ramjet engine project at Curtiss-Wright, and he was designing some of the instrumentation for the B-70, which was going to be the nuclear power-equipped strategic bomber for the U.S. Air Force. So I was part of that culture in New Jersey and then in Southern California. I mean, Buzz Aldrin's daughter Jan sang at my sister's wedding in 1980. We weren't close with the Aldrins, but we were in that culture where, every other kid's father at school worked for Hughes or Parsons or Litton or Lockheed or what have you. And one of the reasons I'm speaking out about Mars and my experience there, even if people believe I'm crazy or they don't believe that we were sending people there via jump room as early as 1981, is because on the 40th anniversary of the lunar landing, somebody that I admire very much, which is astronaut Aldrin, stated on C-SPAN, in an interview on C-SPAN, on American Perspectives on C-SPAN, that we should now begin colonizing Mars. And I don't believe that that's a responsible program for our civilization to undertake. We should initiate and further disclosure about the Martian-Earthian relationship, its historical moorings. We should begin drafting studies of the fragility of the seared desert landscape of Mars with its very vulnerable animal and vegetable species, and really draft, I believe, a Mars protection treaty under the UN to really decide as a civilization how we should engage Mars in a more extensive way. Because if we don't do that, I think we're going to fail our major, essentially, first test of our cosmic citizenship, which is how do we interact responsibly as responsible cosmic citizens with a neighboring planet that is indeed an inhabited planet. So I'm speaking out because I believe that Buzz Aldrin's position, which has also been voiced by individuals like Richard C. Hoagland, who are Mars experts, at a level that clearly I'm still emerging as one, is an irresponsible position. I think that we should really extend the precautionary principle of international environmental law to Mars, not only because it's inhabited and has unique animal and plant species, but because it's our neighboring planet and a fragile ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely. That's that's an interesting point concerning Mars and why the disclosure of inhabitants over there isn't happening, because I think that probably would concern a lot of people in a lot of ways that would be irrational concerning what our attitude towards Mars should be at that point. So I think your idea of having, treating it like a preserve is a great idea.
Well, I mean, we wouldn't think it would be a great thing if we would, build condominium projects in the Anza-Borrega Desert east of San Diego. I mean, what's the point? In Ian McHarg's environmental doctrine, the brilliant environmental planning methodology that Ian McHarg, the great Scottish geographer, evolved in the 1970s, he wrote a book called Design with Nature. And the idea behind that school of environmental planning that I espouse as somebody who has been engaged in urban planning, I have 2 master's degrees in the field, you want to design human settlements in the areas of nature that are least costly to nature, because that way you preserve the biological integrity, the amenity value, and the resource base, and clearly the biodiversity, of those parts of a planet that are most naturally abundant with life, plant and animal life, and with things like the ability to recharge ecosystems, to provide resources, to provide fresh air, fresh water. Now, in the case of Mars, unlike Earth, the entire planet is a large inhabited desert, and therefore it's a sensitive area. It's an area that inherently deserves preservation-based environmental protection. And so that's the problem. So we can't look to Mars as conquerors or colonists. We have to look to Mars as conservationists, because what's on the surface, both in terms of the ancient artifacts that stem to antiquity and the time before and during the solar system catastrophe, and then the way in which the current ecosystem is in some sustainable balance now, may hold important clues to events that have occurred in our solar system that could currently jeopardize Earth, as was shown in the brilliant book by Graham Hancock called The Mars Mystery. I mean, what devastated Mars and Earth during that solar system catastrophe 11,500 years ago may be cyclical. We may be hit with that stuff again. We also want to know how life survived on Mars under such stress, because that may help us, for example, save the existing natural ecosystems on Earth under the stress of population, production, and consumption in the modern instance. Okay, so Mars is an important environmental laboratory for study, not for conquest. And just because it's there and it's relatively denuded of life doesn't mean we own it. As I've said many times, Mars does not belong to us. Mars belongs to the Martians, just as we would assert that Earth belongs to the Earthlings. And so I'm actually probably more passionate about this than time travel, because I think although the introduction of teleportation will allow us to modernize our transportation infrastructure, if we go to Mars and pave it like we've paved large parts of the Earth, we're simply going to be blowing it and engaging in a cosmic folly. It may even invite interplanetary war between us and the indigenous Martian civilization. That's something that we should be working for the opposite. We should be reaching out on a diplomatic basis, applying the kinds of principles that Alfred Weber developed in his book Exopolitics and that Dr. Michael Salla has written about so extensively, and engage the Martian civilization in a responsible way, and the ecology of Mars. And I think that's going to be a growing issue in the 21st century, because we've had personnel there for 30 years, and now the conventional space program in the United States and Russia is now talking about putting astronauts there now for 30 years that we've had chrononauts up there. So now the public is going to be introduced to Mars in the way that we were introduced to the moon in the 1960s. And so I will continue to speak out about the fact that Mars is inhabited, and we should interact with Mars with a view to preserving it, not consuming it.
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually just about out of time here. We can actually keep going in the archives if you have a little more time, but just to let everyone know right now while we're live and streaming, is there any place that they can maybe email you some questions directly, and any events coming up anytime soon, either radio shows or live appearances?
Well, I just appeared at the Ramtha School of Enlightenment. I had a wonderful reception up there. 1,250 people just enthusiastically embraced me. It was just it was a peak experience. And I'm very grateful to J.Z. Knight and her wonderful staff. They were just impeccably professional in hosting me and handling me between sets, and I just had a wonderful time. So that video is going to be posted on both of my websites, ProjectPegasus.net and ProjectMars.net. Even though I just spoke about Pegasus, I'm going to put that up on both sites when I get a hold of a DVD from the Ramtha School of Enlightenment. I was very anecdotal, but I really did sort of do somewhat of a spontaneous autobiographical disclosure. As Buckminster Fuller said, I had some notes, but I had a number of events in my life that prevented me from really preparing. But it ended up being very well received, so I want to get that up when I get a hold of the DVD from Ramtha. I'm going to be speaking at the Free Your Mind Conference in early April in Philadelphia. I'm going to be speaking about both my Mars findings and my Pegasus experiences. When Alfred Weber and Laura Eisenhower and I are hosted by Joan Ocean on the Big Island of Hawaii at Kona in June. She's hosting a dolphins and teleportation seminar. So we'll have a number of lectures about teleportation-based time travel, including some stories about marine mammals actually being teleported aboard interdimensional craft, and then the participants will swim with the dolphins under Joan's tutelage, which will be a great life experience. And so I'm going to be continuing to do lectures like that during the year. I hope to speak at the Pythagoras Conference that Sandy Sabatini and Rick Smith are hosting in Louisville, Kentucky on December 15th of this year, and just really continue to talk. Soon I hope to get some funding to go into a retreat and finish my book about Project Pegasus, because I'm just chomping at the bit to put everything together now in book form, and people are starting to really demand that I do so. So I really want to go on a sabbatical for my law practice. I would just want everybody to know that I have the whole story in writing, but I've really been pinned down under fire here during the recession, because I've been in a situation where I've been practicing law 24/7, 365, but sometimes my clients can't afford to pay me after paying their retainer, or it just ends up being more work than ultimate reward. So I've been trying to extricate myself from my professional situation. I decided to continue to do radio shows because we really want to, even if I don't finish my book before doing so, we really do want the public to have this information as soon as possible so that we can begin lobbying the U.S. government to declassify teleportation. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I have been following your work and watched the entirety of your interview with Jessica Schaub, and I think it's awesome that you brought up the point of the conservationist sort of movement, you can say, of Mars starting now. I mean, I totally agree with you that that is going to be the big issue, and I can understand why you're so passionate about it too. And so all of this, I mean, all the information obviously concerning the teleportation, the time travel, and especially in relation to Mars, because that is really going to be, to me, is what I'm seeing is one of our first tests as a spacefaring race to be able to at least tend to a planet and not just totally destroy it. Like go somewhere and just be like, it's good.
I agree. And if we look at the behavior of the extraterrestrial and interdimensional species or peoples that have visited us, my position is, some people violently disagree with this position, but mine is that in the main, the vast corpus of information that modern ufology has collected has showed that the visitors have primarily upheld the prime directive and not interfered with our civilization. And by that I mean, for example, the absence of mass sighting events. Sure, they've contacted individuals. Sure, it looks like biomedical examinations have been performed on people against their will. At the same time, there's clearly been a pattern of secret alien liaison or extraterrestrial liaison with world governments, especially the United States. But they haven't provoked fear or the alteration of our basic culture by, for example, appearing over Washington, D.C., except in 1952. But they haven't appeared over major cities like they do in a film like Independence Day and actually entered the news cycle in that way. And I think that's intentional. I think doing that so that we're permitted to maintain our inherent timeline. Let me just say that there's really two, just kind of in closing out on the first 2 hours, there's really two futures that now confront us regarding time travel and its positive and negative implications. And I think that I'll use basically teleportation and chronovision as the examples. Clearly, the positive application of teleportation will be to enable us to live in a world where you could jump through a teleport at Grand Central Teleport in New York City and pop out at Union Teleport in Los Angeles several seconds later, literally surviving on the air that we push into the tunnel, which we were doing. We were only surviving on the small gulps of air that were physically pushing in front of our chest and so forth when we jumped through the device in New Jersey. So that's a world where we'll be able to reclaim greater and greater amounts of land that's dedicated to things like airports. Urban planners never talk about the fact that when you look at a map of a city, you may have 10% of the land area of that city dedicated to the airport.
Yeah. And
sometimes a wetland has been covered over, a forest has been cut down, a bay has been filled in artificially because of where they want the planes to come in and so forth. But transportation by planes, trains, and automobiles is incredibly land-intensive and incredibly polluting. We could have lived in a much more of a garden existence on the urban level, in terms of the synergy between the built and the natural environment from 1970 if teleportation had not been kept secret.
Yeah.
If it's too dangerous for humans, if the medical side effect issues rear their ugly head, then at least we can put non-magnetic goods through teleports to take a lot of those 16-wheelers off of our freeways.
Yeah.
16-wheelers that kill a lot of people when they get out of control. They pop a tire and they kill somebody when they fall over on a Volkswagen or whatever. Okay.
Even just efficiency. Just general
efficiency to optimize transportation.
Yeah.
On the
absolutely.
negative side, if it's kept secret, it's simply going to be weaponized, and it will continue to be available as a secret weapon in the permanent warfare economy that's emerged over the last 40 years. So I see preventing the continued secrecy of teleportation as an important peace issue, that if we can apply teleportation for the cause of peace, we may very well end up preventing wars that will emerge as a result of resource competition to maintain the old, obsolete, fuel-intensive, energy-intensive infrastructure. Now, there's also a positive and negative component regarding chronovision and the other the technical remote viewing devices. On the positive side, I mentioned how we'd be able to take school children to museums and libraries where they could see holograms of past events. How cool would that be?
Yeah.
That would clearly spark a revolution in human understanding of the past and in education.
Oh, yeah.
Many children would become scientists who would otherwise not apply themselves in science if they saw how advanced science can really be, how fascinating, the fascinating evidence that the scientific method can generate. And then on the negative side, if we don't declassify or at least disclose the chronovision technology so the general public is aware of its existence, chronovision may be used as the surveillance technology in the 24-hour surveillance state that would be implemented by a police state. We're starting to see some of the elements of a police state being brought down around us. For example, we have to undress just to get aboard a commercial airplane. when we're stopped during a minor traffic stop and not just arrested, but have the hell beaten out of us by a bad cop. I was recently a witness, federal tort claim against a police officer who had 33 former citizens' complaints for the excessive use of force and had put 8 citizens of Portland, Oregon in the hospital in 2004. And the federal judge who was presiding over that case ruled that evidence couldn't come in because it was more prejudicial than probative. Okay, so we're starting to see the emergence of a police state, both on the level of surveillance and of police abuse of the citizenry in an entirely anti-American, anti-constitutional way. And so I'm speaking out about chronovision because we don't want the government surveilling our private conduct at all, absent a search warrant and a public process in front of a magistrate so that the public knows that search warrant exists. In other words, we don't want a permanent secret government, an inside party, as it were, in possession of remote viewing technology that can be abused to violate our privacy. And yet that is what President George W. Bush tasked Admiral John Poindexter to create under the Total Information Awareness Program that was going to be established under DARPA. Chronovision gives the U.S. government secretly, potentially, total information awareness. They can see what you were doing in your bedroom or bathroom, not only in real time behind closed doors and walls, but what you were doing in your bedroom or bathroom 5 years ago and what you might be doing privately 5 years from now. That's an abuse of intelligence gathering that the people deserve to be made aware of. And that's why I'm speaking out in furtherance of their constitutional liberties.
Yeah, that's good. That's, like I said, I can't agree more with all of your efforts because it's true. And I think as we're seeing here on Universal Truth Evolution, we've had a variety of different guests who all speak out and conceptually on the same kind of disclosure, be it technical or psychic or anything else, that where the playing field obviously isn't level, and there's stuff that's impacting the world and just inhibiting things for almost like the sake of it. And so, and I think that all this information really does need to come out now, and I think it's awesome that it's happening. And I think the more we hear about particulars, the more it helps to ground everything too. You know, so and I'm sure, yeah. So, and I think that.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say that, yeah, and I think that it's excellent too that you're a practicing lawyer to help ground that as well. And so, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and in fact, my legal colleagues, my law colleagues who are aware of my work support it. You know, and as does the general public. You know, I think all of us know by now that on the developmental curve, what falls between what the public has been told exists and what actually exists, technically speaking, falls everything that is kept under the umbrella of secrecy. Secrecy would not exist if it was not implemented to keep secret different concepts, formulae, and devices, whether they be weapons or intelligence-gathering devices. So I've received very little resistance to my assertion that, for example, chronovision exists, because people are thinking, well, these are natural extrapolations of what we've already seen. If you can send a television signal across vast distances in space, why wouldn't you be able to create a magnetic effect where you would bend a non-local timeline into a laboratory or onto a television-like screen? People see the analogs to technologies that were made public, and they also know they've been lied to. And I say, well, wait a minute. You can't tell me that with trillions of dollars of funding, you know, when I defend the assertion that I'm telling the truth, which I am, I say, you know, you can't tell me that with trillions of dollars of funding, the U.S. Defense Department was only making the next generation of nuclear warheads. I mean, that's silly.
Okay.
You know, when we hear stories from Gulf War veterans that they had 100 actual tanks invading Baghdad, but 900 holographic tanks making Saddam Hussein believe that Baghdad was being invaded by 1,000 tanks. You know, we hear that from our own relatives who served in the Gulf and so forth, the Gulf Wars. You know, this stuff starts to trickle back to people, and people think, well, wait a minute. If the remote viewing technology that was on the helicopter in that feature film Blue Thunder was already 10 years behind, you know, there were newspaper articles, magazine articles being written about the fact that that technology was 10 years behind when that movie was filmed. People can readily grok the fact that what I'm talking about is simply the technologies that are between, on that part of the graph, you know, that part of the XY axis between what they've told us and what ultimately has been achieved. And that's why secrecy exists. So they get the linkage to, the fact that these things have been lurking out there under the umbrella of official state secrecy. And people are really supportive of the fact that I'm sharing with what I know, even at the risk of coming into conflict with the government over that. But yes, I've gotten a really heartwarming reception, and I'm really proud of my fellow Americans in that sense, because they listen and they say, as George Norrie did on my second appearance on Coast to Coast AM this November, he started off the show saying, I listened to you, Andy, and I thought, I really think this guy's telling the truth. And I said, George, I am, because I've spent 10 years investigating what I was part of. So I've done my work, and I think the American people are doing theirs by being open-minded enough to know that their government has achieved phenomenal technical feats, but has also made the policy decision to keep them secret. And in many cases, that's been short-sighted because very valuable technologies have been kept back from the people. And that's what I'm trying to correct.
Yeah, absolutely. And then as we see, the implications just are everywhere, from economics to transportation to agriculture to, it's like how the illustration that you made of having holographic glimpses into time makes history way more interesting to a lot of kids. So this is all stuff that, and I think that, that was, when I saw that article that I was mentioning earlier this morning, it really kind of, it frustrated me because, people, they talk about overpopulation, but then as you're talking about just Mars being a hostile place, it's like, even to do altruistic work, it's treacherous. We're going to need people to go and do this kind of thing and go out to other places and check things out. So we actually technically need more people than what we have currently. So to be doing
yes,
much...
You're right. We need more astronauts and chrononauts, and one of the reasons that teleportation is going to be so significant is its relative low cost. Yes, so we're going to need more explorers of the cosmos. I'm totally pro-exploration. I mean, I had the cosmic privilege of being one of humanity's original time-space explorers, and I try to put that in perspective. I'm totally pro-exploration. Yeah. But I think in engaging a third planet like Mars, we should do the right thing environmentally and not view it just as a place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I've had these conversations with other people too concerning extraterrestrial involvement, and how it does seem that there is that whole prime directive, hands-off, general kind of approach, that there's a balance. And so I feel that even when we get to this point where that's happening, obviously there's interest that they have in relation to the interest that we're doing, and they're not there. Then it gets into exopolitics, and so there's going to be more push-pull than I think than just, even if someone like Rumsfeld's like, let's go ahead and glass him, motherfucker. It's like, no, it's just I'm sure there's going to be extraterrestrials are going to say, you know what, I don't think that's a good idea because we're doing blah on here. You know what I mean? There's probably going to be more to it than that too. So I think preparing our minds for that, kind of exploration where it is truly just for knowledge and expansion of awareness, is really where we have to put our minds, really, in general, because everything has been orientated towards military applications and and all that.
NASA is a military organization. NASA is a military organization. When the fateful event actually was on the time travel side was when, not the space exploration side, but the time space exploration side of the Defense Department. The critical event was when Tesla's papers were seized at the New Yorker Hotel in Manhattan upon his death on January 9th of 1943. You can even find in the conventional biographies, for example, Margaret Cheney's biography of Tesla, there were two teams of two individuals racing to his flat to seize his documents. Two were FBI, special agents for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Two were officers for the War Department, military officers working for the War Department. The War Department got there and then forwarded those papers to the Los Alamos physicists. So the whole legacy of Tesla, the whole propagation of the Philadelphia experiment cover story to cover the actual Philadelphia experiment, has been an elaborate attempt in books and TV shows and movies to de-link the critical connection between Tesla, teleportation, and the Los Alamos physicists. Pegasus, that it became under Dr. Harold Agnew's directorship, was Project Manhattan's secret twin. The two individuals were actually inside the ship when they tried to teleport during World War II. It wasn't the Eldridge, it was the Martha's Vineyard. And John von Neumann and Einstein were inside. J. Robert Oppenheimer and Edward Teller were inside the ship. So time travel emerged in a discrete scientific community within the U.S. society, and that is the atomic research community centered in New Mexico and centered in the atomic bomb project. And that's what they've been concealing. I not only met Dr. Agnew, who was one of the principal atomic scientists from the Manhattan Project. I met Dr. Teller when he was trying to repair one of the chronovisors during one of those summers we spent in New Mexico. He was just swearing. He was frustrated that he couldn't get it to work. He wasn't even generating the hologram. And I was standing next to my father in the hallway at the Los Alamos National Labs when he explained to the Manhattan Project physicist Emilio Segre that we were in New Mexico and at the Los Alamos Labs that day on, as my dad put it, a teleportation project based at Sandia. So this is a major part of U.S. technical history that needs to be illuminated. The fact that group of physicists not only achieved the development of the atomic bomb, but also developed the practical time travel. So that 25 years later, in that conversation between my dad and Harold Agnew, my dad said, "Have you tried it yet?" Namely, have you teleported yet? And Agnew said, "No, but I want to." So 25 years after Tesla's death, it had been reduced to practice as a practical teleporter, and they were even starting to teleport children. And I was certainly the first American child, although they had previously used some orphans from Latin America that they brought up to be participants in some of these defense projects. And that's a human rights aspect of the story that I'm also sharing. That poor, unfortunate orphans from the streets of major metropolitan areas in South and Central America were basically provided to the U.S. government by the right-wing authoritarian dictatorships of that era and used as guinea pigs in our defense testing. And that's constant disclosures that Captain Ernest Garcia made about the abuse of the Yanomamo Indians in Central America in the germ and biowarfare experimentation. So, I am a whistleblower. Innocent people were harmed. Children were used in a way that was where they were involved in new, dangerous, and experimental activity. But in terms of my own involvement, I kind of adhere to my dad's position, which is you don't progress as a species if you're not willing to take your children with you when you ford the stream. He used the example of, well, what if you had a group of human beings who were on an island or like on a peninsula going into a river, and their hunting grounds or their farmlands were exhausted, and they had to ford a river with their children on their shoulders. If one of the children drowned, they were still reaching the distant shore where the whole tribe was surviving. Okay, so my dad's analogy was that involving children in dangerous passages that improve the prospects of the tribe is an inherently human activity. And human beings have to be willing to do that because, for example, if we were going to use teleportation to move the president and vice president around the planet, sometimes his children would have to go with him. And it certainly would be terrible to have the president and vice president teleporting and then have their kids show up, in Sydney, 24 hours later via airplane. So my father understood that we were really at an emergent point in human history where a new paradigm was coming into existence. And I think that he was proud that both he and I were involved. I'm proud that he invited or tolerated or allowed me to be recruited in the project. And, in fact, shortly before his death in 1990, he asked me to tell the world about what we achieved in Project Pegasus because he said, look, Andy, we were part of something that was the emergence of time travel, and we were part of it. So I'm very proud that I was involved. I feel cosmically privileged. Sure, I've got some medical issues, but, hey, issues just based on the building that they work in. I have medical issues at midlife here as a result of being, somebody who was involved in the emergence of time-space exploration. So I just buck up and deal with it, and I'm proud that I was permitted to be involved.
Yeah, that's an awesome attitude, and that's why, everyone here listening, myself among all, are just so privileged to really talk to you because I understand the implications of this information, and I believe you're telling the truth because it honestly correlates with just about everything else that one could just observe without bias. Observe. and see that it fits in. You know what I mean? And that's one thing I think that.
Well, actually, Jerry, let me address that, because this will show. This anecdote will show the linkage to stuff that's right in front of us, but that we never figure out because we don't have all the information.
Mm-hmm.
Remember when Dan Rather left the anchor seat at CBS News?
Yeah.
After being arguably the most distinguished anchor in the history of CBS News.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he covered Watergate. He covered ably and well. He covered the Challenger disaster like a total trooper. He covered the Tiananmen Square massacres, where he was almost killed by Chinese troops. Dan Rather was summarily dismissed from CBS as a result of that controversy, in which he was trying to establish whether President George W. Bush had evaded his military duties in 1973. And there was a whole issue over Rather being provided some spurious documents, and that he had used them in his report on where George W. Bush was in the early 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're never told where George Bush probably was in 1973. But when my father and I encountered he and his father in the early 70s, they had just been informed that they were both going to be president. So presumably, George Bush was then soon put through some kind of training program relative to the presidency.
Yeah.
So here we had our greatest TV news anchor of our era losing his well-earned position as a great TV journalist to perpetuate the time travel cover-up and the concealment of the linkage between quantum access and the U.S. presidency. So that was just one of the things I wanted to mention, as that was right in front of all of us, at least those of us who keep abreast of the news.
Yeah.
And yet it never reached the public that the danger that George Bush the danger that Dan Rather was presented to the political establishment was an ultimate finding, possibly, that George W. Bush was being trained for the presidency in 1973. That's why we were told he was in the Texas Air National Guard, and then we were told he didn't report for duty and was volunteering on the congressional campaign of one of his father's friends in Alabama or Mississippi. Then we were told his whereabouts were unknown. At one point, it was skiing like Howard Dean was all over the country and the world at that point. But I believe he was probably in a university-presented seminar on the presidency.
Yeah, no, that's awesome that you bring that up, because honestly, I never even thought about that either. Like, that makes sense to me though, because I remember during the whole time, obviously of his presidency, it was all these kind of interesting moves made and all these other things, and I remember that when during the campaign, even when that came up at first, and then throughout his presidency, they're like, well, where was he all this time when he was AWOL? What happened to him? And ultimately, it was kind of like unknown. This makes sense though, in relation to society, that sort of society and how they would function, and even how, Aaron McCollum, who helped start the Universal Truth Evolution, how he said about being in the Coast Guard, but then he would be sent off to other ops, like to kind of cover up what the other stuff that was going on. And so to me, it fits in. Yeah.
Yeah. Intelligence operators are always detailed to a certain branch of the military. I think Aaron was detailed to the Coast Guard, so that's consistent. But when I met Barack Obama in Los Angeles in 1982, we were 20 years old, and he had already been placed during that first year at Columbia in an 8-student seminar group under Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had just served as National Security Advisor for Carter. So if we can extrapolate from that, if President Obama was already being groomed, and by the way, the subject of that seminar was nuclear disarmament. And in fact, President Obama has been involved in extrapolating and in developing, rather, and continuing the nuclear disarmament program with the former Soviet Union, with Russia, that was begun during the Nixon years when quantum access emerged. But since we know that President Obama was placed with the last previous National Security Advisor as his professor and advisor as a junior at Columbia, certainly back in the early 70s, it's logical that George W. Bush would have been run through some other sort of educational program that a distinguished person or educator would have sponsored to prepare him for the foreign policy considerations and just the the major issues that would confront his presidency. I'm sure that if they did that for Obama, they probably were doing it previously for the other presidents who had been identified via the time travel technologies that were operational by 1970.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one question that I was wondering if you had a take on, because concerning Dan Burrish and his story. Are you familiar with him at all?
I am, and I have a discrete take on the Dan Burrish literature derived by Project Camelot, and also on the Montauk literature of Nichols and Moon.
Yeah.
This is what I can say. I can say that Dan Burrish's data is extremely provocative to me, because he combines a number of major elements that are either part and parcel of or major sidebars to my experiences of Project Pegasus. Certainly, the existence of the looking glass technologies, even though they were always called chronovisors when I was a kid on the project in the early 70s, I shouldn't say never. I only heard them once described as a looking glass to the past, but never as looking glass technology. So that may have been a later term of art that was used. He describes alien liaison and also in the New Mexico research and development context. I can certainly confirm that was going on during those years, although my caveat on that is that time travel was pretty much the accomplishment of Earthlings rather than reverse engineering of alien technology. And then the whole concern about a mega event that would cause the federal government, a catastrophe that would cause the federal government to place a continuity of government hub in the American Southwest, the Four Corners region.
Yeah.
I can completely corroborate. One claim that Dan makes that certainly was never discussed when I was in Pegasus, and based on my experiences I have trouble believing is true, is his notion that the chronovisor arrays, the looking glass technologies, actually have destabilized the quantum hologram, the time-space continuum. I don't believe that's the case. They may have caused people to move between timelines, but people move in timelines all the time and only create slight disequilibriums of time-space, or none at all. I believe that the most destructive to the time-space continuum are atomic weapons, and we should be talking about banning atomic explosions because they tear the physical substrates of the time-space continuum.
Yeah,
setting up a local chronovisor where you're lensing a non-local event into the room may be as harmless as turning on a television set. I simply don't believe it was creating the gross catastrophic effects that he reports.
Yeah, I
don't know what to make of his connection between extraterrestrial liaison in the classified research realm and time travel. What it seems to do is perpetuate the Tesla cover-up, the Philadelphia experiment cover story that delinks Tesla, teleportation, and Los Alamos physicists by ascribing the chronovisors and the teleporters to extraterrestrials. So I vehemently oppose those aspects of the story. In the case of the Project Montauk books authored by Preston Nichols and Peter Moon, that subject comes up a lot because their writing about that topic goes back to the early 90s. I can confirm two major elements of their account. One is the involvement of Jack Pruitt. He is a real person. They identify him as the research director for Montauk. I met him first in the summer of 1967, actually, quite early in my project years. Jack's a real guy, and he was decent in the way that he met with me in New Mexico in June of 2003. So he's actually one of the heroes of the story. He's one of the project principals who stepped forward and helped me in my investigation. And I'm so sorry that his son has died as a result of complications from the project, presumably. But Jack and my father and Courtney Hunt and a couple of people aligned with the intelligence community, when people read my book, they're going to see that they're much bigger heroes than they would think at this time. Jack was certainly one of them because he stepped forward at risk of his own life to brief me on some of the consequences of having been involved in the project.
Yeah.
I can also state that the Montauk chair exists because I took, maybe about 100 probes to my own subjective future between spring of 1970 and summer of 1972 in the Montauk chair. The Montauk chair is a magnetic transducer that bumps you forward in time so you directly experience a moment in your own subjective future. And that's the one that I think was reverse engineered from the ET craft, because if you're flying through space or even time-space in an object, you want to think where you're going and just go there rather than have any kind of hand-eye coordination piloting the craft. And that apparently is what the Montauk Chair is. I had a discussion with Dr. Sal about that, because during the time when we were introduced to the Montauk Chair, we were also participating in exercises where we would put, as psychic children, where we would put our hands on metal hand plates and use our minds to try to control the articulation of a lenticular craft on a screen in front of us. So some of the ET technology was being experimented with, and I think that the Montauk Chair was probably the legacy of the reverse engineering of the Roswell and other ET crashes. I have to say that there are some gaps in their work that I think are unusual. One is that they don't mention Project Pegasus. They don't talk about how more advanced things were going on 15 years earlier, because, of course, the developmental timeline for Montauk was the early 80s, but the inception of the quantum access technologies that were being researched and developed by Project Pegasus was the mid-1960s. So we started 15 years earlier with more advanced technology. They're pretty much focusing on the Montauk Chair. That makes sense because one of the benefits or positive aspects from the perspective of time travel of the Montauk Chair is it allowed you to visit the future without putting the person sitting in the chair at physical risk as a result of going there. And so it's quite logical and quite reasonable that there would have been a spin-off from Pegasus that would have been put under Jack Pruitt at another location. And, of course, Long Island is very close to New Jersey, and actually push the envelope of what they were doing with the Montauk Chair. The kinds of things they probably did, for example, irradiating the participant, the person occupying the chair, that may explain some of the unusual effects, the unusual time-space effects, and some of the deaths and injuries that they report occurred in Project Montauk. Who knows what they were doing with the Montauk Chair? In one instance, I was being given a small metabolite of mescaline to kind of space me out and see if it could amp up my ability to see aspects of my future when I was taking one of those astral projections in the Montauk Chair. So I know they were experimenting with kids in the Montauk Chair. So that may have literally become Project Montauk. So I think the project existed. I believe they're telling the truth, but I just have to say that there are major gaps in their story to include, for example, any mention of Jack Pruitt being one of the team leaders on Project Pegasus.
Yeah, I've noticed that there's, to me, it kind of sounds compartmentalized madness again, because I see like how, because he talks a lot about S4, and there's a lot of disinformation about S4, and then it also is congruent, though, with the time aspect, because I know the large portion of what Dan talked about wasn't with extraterrestrials, was with other future human kind of extraterrestrials in a sense, which integrates that time aspect. But then he also talked about the political figures using that chronovision to see into those possible futures, and he talked about how Hillary Clinton is supposed to be a president right now, but obviously it was Barack Obama. So there's like incongruencies, there's inconsistencies, but then that also is congruent with the whole concept of the future really being possibility versus probability kind of ratio, and seeing how the collective consciousness pulls that into focus inevitably. But I was curious.
Well, I actually think it was based on the subjective nature of the Montauk Chair. I had said let me give you an example of what I mean. The Montauk Chair was bumping people's consciousness forward so they would perceive some aspect of their future. When I was on Project Pegasus, Major Ed Dames was taking me through some of the chronovisor probes during some of my time in New Mexico. Dames was one of the project principals that I've called upon to reveal what he knows about Pegasus. But he has yet, I've done so publicly, by the way, too, and he has yet to respond. But we are Facebook friends, so that's a start. Now, in one of those probes with Ed, I told him that I had seen President John Kerry. And he said, when he was taking his lab notes, he said, "Did you say President John Kennedy?" And I said, "No, I was in my future, and I saw President John Kerry." And he said, "Where?" And I said, "Giving a public address." Well, what I was actually accessing from my future was seeing John Kerry running for president. And I was standing behind him when he spoke in downtown Portland when he was running for president. And I believe he was introduced by Howard Dean. So I believe it was causing these errors, like a Hillary Clinton presidency, is that the data that the Montauk chair rides were gathering were subjective. So somebody, for example, could have seen Hillary Clinton in the 2008 presidential debates and concluded that she was president. But it may have said, they may have seen a television set of the debate when they're in the Montauk chair from their own actual subjective future and seen, Senator Hillary R. Clinton, and then seen, Democratic presidential debate below that on the screen, and then simply conflated those elements and then told the people debriefing them that they saw somebody named Hillary R. Clinton as president of the United States rather than as a presidential candidate. I think that goes to the actual form of quantum access that the Montauk chair was allowing. It was subjective. So, for example, when I gave my first talk about Pegasus in 2004, I basically joked to the attendees, and I said, so those of you who are Democrats like me, you'll be happy to know that John Kerry wins the presidency. Well, that was based on me telling Ed Daines that I saw President John Kerry, but when I look back on what I had seen during that Montauk chair-based probe to the future, it wasn't John F. Kerry being sworn in or giving the State of the Union address or appearing at a presidential press conference. It was the real-time images of seeing him outdoors with Howard Dean electioneering in Portland, Oregon when he was running for president. So that may explain some of the discrepancies. Because remember, the Montauk chair boosts you to your own subjective timeline. So it was highly reliable on a linear basis, unlike, let's say, the chronovisors, which were taking slices of adjacent timelines. The Montauk chair, for the most part, was directing people to their actual future. So, for example, many of the things I saw during my Montauk chair rides have since happened. I even gave one of my brothers the name of his wife 8 years before he met her. He doesn't remember it. I do, because I told the lady from DARPA what the name of one of my sister-in-laws from the future was and described her. So, it basically was allowing people to gather personal data, and then the lady from DARPA, the psychologist, would then try to get you to sort of scan the environment, the personal environment that you were sent to derive other information. Well, there was a newspaper on the coffee. What was the headline? That type of thing. The president was talking to television. Who was it? So forth. So the Montauk chair was highly subjective, but also highly reliable. And I think what colored the accounts and seemed to skew them and make them seem like alternate timelines were involved was the fact that people were misinterpreting what they were seeing of their own future.
That makes sense. That actually does make a lot of sense, and once again is congruent with a lot of the information in other projects where you see that at one point subjectivity becomes an issue. I would guess, my own postulation, having to deal with just the quantum mechanic aspect of our reality here of that unknown factor. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the questions that I did have, though, too, is that are you in contact with any other participants in Project Pegasus?
Well, I've sought out the adult participants. I've spoken with Dr. Harold Agnew. When I initially called him in 2000, he stated that I was mistaken, that the teleportation project wasn't based at Lano, and then he said it was at one of the other labs in New Mexico, so keep looking, which was, of course, Sandia. I spoke with the then director of DARPA, Dr. Stephen J. Lukasik, and he remembered that there was a project title named Pegasus, and he thought it involved lasers, but of course, as the director of DARPA, he would have had hundreds of projects coming over his desk during those years. But he did state that they were working with children during those years, and that they were doing so to basically involve bright children in Cold War-related defense research and development activities, so they would become scientists and engineers for the Defense Department. I spoke with Cliff Harris, the climatologist, after I was forwarded to him through a favor that I would salute Robert Felix, the Ice Age theorist, for opening up for me. Cliff remembered that when he was working with Dr. Ivan Browning, the Director of Science and Technology for the CIA, in the early 70s, everything I'm talking about, Ivan told him. So yes, that's hearsay in a court of law, but that's valid social science evidence at the level of public policy and social science. I tried to meet with Dr. Sterling Colgate several times in New Mexico, but he rebuffed my advances. He's certainly someone who could confirm the existence of the project. I met with a CIA representative during my first fact-finding trip I met with Jack Pruitt, and he discussed the medical consequences. I met surreptitiously with Governor Bill Richardson at the old car show in Chama, New Mexico in June of 2003, and he explained why he supported my investigation but couldn't help me publicly.
Mm-hmm.
I have spoken with, at that time I spoke with a representative of the executive office of the White House who told me that if I didn't cease and desist my investigation and talking and writing about the technologies involved, that the Bush administration couldn't guarantee my survival. And I also reached out to the children who were in the learning lab in New Jersey. Now, one of the problems with trying to establish the validation of your memories of these types of projects with other participants is everybody's going through the program on a kind of a planned matrix in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, some of the children, all of the children I remembered being in the learning lab, and it was like 6 or 7, confirmed different aspects of my memory of the quantum access stuff that went on in the learning lab. For example, the Montauk chair being present. But when it got to the point where I was trying to take them to remember that we had done stuff off campus, they were generally not overcoming their brainwashing. So, for example, I would have a discussion like that on a Saturday morning, and then the next Saturday morning when I called them, they would not only not remember that what I was talking about regarding the project, but they would not remember not even talking to me. So there were some very weird epistemological reactions from the co-participants. One of them, I was successfully getting to remember the teleporting, and he said, "Oh God, you're making me remember this after all these years. It's been blocked." And then he panicked and hung up the phone. So I received enough corroboration from my interviews with my co-participants in the learning lab in New Jersey, some of whom I can place in New Mexico and some of the other project locations, to know that I was remembering something that had actually happened and that it involved not just psi testing and training, but time travel. And I'll describe that in my book. But they weren't perfect informants, but they were substantial enough in what they shared to show that we went far beyond parapsychology and were involved in and exposed to time travel technology.
Very interesting, very interesting. Because that's the other thing too, is that whistleblowers such as yourself kind of paving the way, and it really does help to open up more channels for those in different projects as well, and corroborate piece by piece. So it's and obviously with and that really was more of a personal question, because it's kind of like, I know things like that, obviously you'll be able to find out information that other people just won't come forward with and such, because I'm sure a lot of them weren't too eager to kind of step into that whistleblower shoes either. So.
Right. Now, one thing I found out about Santa Fe, I was informed by a college professor who was liaising to the CIA and the ONI for me, is that they knew I was telling the truth about the teleportation to Santa Fe. Well, the term chronovaser came up in their literature, so they were able to search chrono. When they tried to explore whether I was telling the truth regarding Santa Fe being kind of like the time-space depot where they kept on sending teleportees, of course, my field investigation would turn up people who in the early 70s heard stories about kids suddenly popping into view in the state capitol complex. And I will provide the names of several informants who corroborated my account of being a quantum leaper into Santa Fe. But one of the things I was informed through my friend from CIA was that individuals who had relocated in Santa Fe were sort of recovering memories of having teleported there as children. And they were fascinated by Santa Fe and actually, in some cases, relocated there, literally moved there. And then as they began to explore Santa Fe, had come into confrontation with their memories. So with 140 participants and the average American moving every 2 years, what's happened in the intervening 40 years is that some of my co-teleportees have literally moved to Santa Fe only to come into confrontation with their memories. So somewhere in those files from the late 90s and early 10s is, chatter about them corroborating people who provided information to the government after they certainly woke up to the fact that they had been involved in teleporting there as kids. And in fact, some of them, I was told that some of them had even identified me as the catalyst for the public discourse on this subject. So there again, you have the nonlinear dimension, and the psychic dimension to our whole set of experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so these other participants, were they just from the United States, or were they from Canada too? Were they from other nations?
Well,
the
first group of teleportees were U.S. Navy enlisted personnel. The first 3 died of asphyxiation because the tunnel that was propagated was too long, and they ran out of oxygen. The second group were a cadre of children who were adopted or taken to the United States under the aegis of the right-wing authoritarian governments in Latin America and used as guinea pigs before they knew whether or not the teleportation would kill a child.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the third, as my father later explained, I was in the third group that was placed together as a cadre of 140 children, 14 regiments of 10 kids, 14 divisions. I was the captain of blue team. Each of the divisions was identified by a color. So I was the captain of blue team, and so people from other country were used in the sense that Latin American school children came up, participated, they survived their experiences, and they were adopted into American households. So
interesting.
Pardon me.
Yeah, no worries at all.
The reason I describe myself as the first American child to teleport is I had that previous one-off teleport to New Mexico with my dad as a 6-year-old.
That's very, very interesting, because I know that, because it makes me think too, like if how your involvement was really the fine-tuning of this apparatus. So it makes me think, it's like, where is it now? You know what I mean? So
yeah, they were. In fact, that's exactly what we were. We were the bright, healthy, emotionally stable, cooperative, observant children that they ran through the ropes. Like, let's say the first children would be in a presidential family. You know, the Obama girls. You know, we were young kids who were, born of, intelligent, stable, loving parents, like our presidential families have been. So they were testing the human factors affecting an American child, at least at the level of privilege to have enough food to eat and a safe, loving home to live in, and a good school to go to. So they were just testing the basic biological parameters with the Latin American orphans who were sort of exploited more as guinea pigs. They were getting baseline from us. How would an 8-year-old son of the president deal with this experience?
Yeah, and I like the way you described the process as it was relayed to you in terms of the decisions that had to be made, because they are legitimate ones. I can understand how some of these tough decisions have to be made in terms of research and advancement. But as we know, I think that there are other ways we can accomplish the same goal, and so it's important to. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, no, I think, Jerry, we have to take a nuanced approach to our analysis. People serving in government are fellow Americans like us, right? So if we can assume arguendo that if given their positions in decision-making, we might reach similar decisions, we should be somewhat cautious about judging them too harshly historically.
Exactly. Yes.
I think it's clear that they were under the unique circumstances of the Cold War, a Cold War being carried out vis-a-vis the former Soviet Union, with the wild card being who these extraterrestrials were and what they wanted, where they were from, and why they were visiting Earth.
Yeah.
So there was a great deal of tension inside the defense technical community to furnish the U.S. government with technical capabilities that would allow us to survive. So I don't think that was a mistake. I don't think it was a mistake, for example, to keep it secret after World War II. The problem is that were the ramifications of those decisions, not the moral blame that we could cast on the participants. Because after all, their business was to prevent war. If they could improve our intelligence gathering or even our delivery of troops to the battlefield, they knew they could prevent a lot of human carnage. Imagine a trigger point in the world where you suddenly teleport 20,000 Marines from Camp Lejeune right where the trigger point is. With ceramic M1 rifles, right? They're not going to be taking metal weapons through the tunnel, but with let's say a ceramic rifle with some kind of ceramic bullet or something that's non-magnetic.
Yeah.
Okay, so they knew that they would be able to prevent a lot of the damage of warfare if they had a greater mastery over the time-space environment. And so I don't judge that generation harshly. I kind of endorse Tom Brokaw's definition of that generation as the greatest generation. I profoundly admire my father and the other guys and women on the project. The problem is that over time, because it's remained secret, we haven't been able to ponder the ramifications of the decision to make these technologies secret, and therefore we haven't been able to apply them in a more nuanced, intelligent way in the present to advantage humans on Earth. And that's the task for our generation. If theirs was survival and peace in the nuclear age, ours is going to have to be prosperity and sustainability in the time-space age.
That's a good way to put it. I think that has never been really framed as well in that sense. Because, as we're seeing the implications of these technologies extend past the destruction that came with the knowledge of the nuclear bomb. And we're seeing how the implications through time, just psychically, then as well as physically, it's just a whole new frontier and a whole new understanding of our role in this universe is just required,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in the way that philosophers, Norman Cousins and Norman Thomas and A.J. Muste and other pacifists and Bertrand Russell, people worrying about the advent of nuclear weapons, it's stated in the literature of the disarmament movement that the concern was that, in fact, Albert Einstein had voiced the concern that with the atomic bomb, our technology had outstripped our morality. It outstripped our moral imagination, our political organization, our social organization. Well, that may have been true during the Cold War, but we ended up not having a civilization-destroying nuclear war.
Yep.
But on the other side of the classified research realm, time travel did have that impact. The secret technology did outpace social and political organization and morality because it ended up subverting the presidency. Legal protocols, the social protocols for selecting chief executive of the greatest, the most prominent country on the planet.
Yep.
So I think there's an analogy there, and I think that occurred because the impact of time travel was never debated publicly. How could it not ultimately undermine government? So it has, and that's one of the reasons I'm speaking out.
Yeah, absolutely. Not to mention a lot of the other implications that go into things in terms of what it takes to create such a project and how those are all linked to all these other military aimed projects. When as you and I are espousing, that we need to now shift our focus from the military applications into more of the sociological applications, because times are changing. I mean, obviously. So
right. We're gonna have 9 billion human beings on this. Unless there's a major catastrophe, we're going to have 9 billion inhabitants of Earth by 2045, which was the year they were sending forward to recover the data scrolls of future events. And unless we have some world war decide to kill off half the population or something, or 90% of it, which is the Georgia Guidestones calls for, we're going to have to provide food, shelter, healthcare, and education to those 9 billion humans. Well, clearly, therefore, we have to address the energy infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure of our planet. I mean, I've seen some reports that if the Chinese went to an American standard of car ownership, that is 2 cars per family, that would produce so much greenhouse emissions that we would have coastal flooding around the world. Planners in California have found that every time they add a lane to a freeway, it fills up with cars in 30 days. So the orthographic approaches in planning, where you try to provide more city and less nature, or more of the same energy-intensive infrastructure, are failing. They're not just bad ideas. They're not just something that can be objected to from the perspective of an environmentalist. They are failing to meet the needs of society. Are we not failing when the average person who's working in a metropolitan area is spending basically 2 hours a day in a traffic jam, just sitting in their car, getting overweight, developing diabetes? So our transportation infrastructure is failing. At a minimum, during this generation, I would say by 2020, we're at least going to have to introduce teleportation to move goods.
Yeah.
I believe we're moving people between major world capitals by 2020. So when people ask me, well, you were given all this knowledge of the future. Well, I wasn't given a whole heck of a lot of knowledge of the future, but I was given some. I'm calling for teleportation by 2020 because that's my position. That's what I'm trying to encourage. But I don't have any discrete knowledge of when it develops in the public sector. All I know is, based on what I'm told, is that my truth campaign related to teleportation serves as the historical bridge between what Project Pegasus accomplished in the early 70s and ultimate societal adoption of teleportation. But I'm looking forward, to cutting that red ribbon at Grand Central Teleport in New York City. I can see that.
Yeah. I can't wait to see the pictures there too for you doing that because, I honor those who older than my generation. I'm in my 30s here, early 30s, and recognizing all the changes that are happening here and knowing that there's generations that are well aware of all of this stuff way before I was even around. And have been holding space for these changes to finally manifest. It's very exciting, and it's an honor to have someone like yourself on this show, have these conversations, and be part of this new world, really. So we're probably going to get cut off here in 3 minutes, so just to let you know, we're almost going to get cut off in our message. So.
Yeah, so I think that's very apropos of where we're at. I mean, I don't think we should continue to live in a world in which the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the greatest generation don't live in the time-space age that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers made possible. I mean, Nikola Tesla started working operationally with teleportation at the experimental level in 1899.
There you go.
Okay?
Yep.
It's 112 years later.
Yeah.
Okay? And official sources are still misinforming the public about when teleportation will emerge. Well, it emerged over 100 years ago. It was reduced to practice by the U.S. Defense Technical Community for safe transit of human beings by 1967-68. And so I think it should define the 21st century. And so I'm going to keep on pushing. I'm not going to give in. I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep on telling the truth. And then as witnessed by the million viewers I've had so far with that interview that I did with Jessica, I'm not going to stop until everybody on this planet knows that the U.S. government achieved time travel 40 years ago and that